London, 1887. The night they tried to destroy him. They gathered like wolves in silk, circling the fallen predator they believed was finally vulnerable. The Imperial Founders Gala had transformed into an execution masked as celebration, and every aristocrat in Westminster Hall knew it. Duke Cedric Blackthorne stood alone at the center of the marble floor, while 300 pairs of eyes waited for blood. He'd ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist for a decade, crushed rebellions before they could breathe, reduced rival houses to ash with nothing more than his signature on parchment. But tonight, the empire he'd built through fear had turned its teeth toward him. The conspiracy had been brewing for months, whispered in private clubs and sealed with foreign gold, and now it was here, dressed in evening wear and dripping with false sympathy. They thought he was finished. They were about to learn what a man becomes when you take everything except his capacity for violence. Stay close. This isn't a story about redemption. It's about what happens when the monster stops pretending to be civilized. The first sign of collapse came 3 weeks earlier, though Cedric didn't recognize it as such at the time. He'd been standing in his study at Blackthorne Manor, reviewing ledgers that documented the slow hemorrhaging of his Northern Rail empire, when his chief financial advisor, Marcus Thorne, entered without knocking. That alone should have warned him. Marcus never forgot protocol. The man had ice water in his veins and a mind that could calculate compound interest faster than most men could breathe. But that morning, Marcus looked like he'd seen ghosts. Cedric didn't glance up from the papers spread across his desk. The morning light cut through the tall windows behind him, casting his shadow across reports that outlined losses he couldn't explain. Someone was bleeding his holdings dry through 1,000 tiny cuts. Each transaction perfectly legal, each loss just small enough to avoid immediate notice. Perfectly orchestrated. Marcus cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we have a situation." Cedric finally looked up. His advisor stood near the door like a man preparing to run. That was interesting. Marcus had witnessed Cedric destroy men's lives over breakfast without flinching. Whatever had put that particular shade of fear in his eyes had to be catastrophic. "Speak plainly, Marcus. I don't have time for theater. The Ashford Holdings." Marcus's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "They've called the loans." Cedric went very still. The Ashfords were minor nobility, barely worth his attention under normal circumstances. But 6 months ago, during a liquidity crisis, he'd secured a significant loan using Ashford capital as bridge financing. The arrangement had been mutually beneficial, discreet, and structured to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. Calling those loans early would require cash he didn't currently have liquid. "When?" Cedric's voice could have frozen mercury. "This morning. Full payment due within 30 days, or they seize the collateral properties." The collateral properties included 3 rail stations and a shipping warehouse that formed the backbone of his northern supply chain. Losing them would create cascading failures across his entire operation. Contracts would default. Partnerships would dissolve. His reputation for absolute financial stability would shatter. And in a world where power was measured in perception as much as pounds sterling, reputation was survival. Cedric stood slowly, his movements controlled despite the rage beginning to build behind his sternum. Who authorized this? Lord Ashford himself signed the documents, but Marcus hesitated, and that hesitation contained volumes. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The timing." Marcus pulled a folded newspaper from inside his jacket. "This morning's financial section." Cedric took the paper and read. The article was small, buried on page 7, but its implications were nuclear. An anonymous source had leaked details about Blackthorne's recent cash flow problems to the financial press. Nothing specific enough to be actionable, just enough to make investors nervous. Just enough to make calling loans seem reasonable. "This is coordinated," Cedric said quietly. "Yes, Your Grace." "How many other creditors are moving?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. Cedric walked to the window and looked out over the grounds of Blackthorne Manor. Beyond the manicured gardens and stone walls lay the city that had once bent to his will through sheer force of reputation. He'd built his empire on a simple principle: be more ruthless than anyone else could stomach being. Make examples brutal enough that others chose submission over resistance. Fear was cheaper than loyalty and far more reliable. But fear was also a finite resource. The moment you showed weakness, the moment the monster looked vulnerable, everyone who'd ever bent the knee started wondering if they could drive the knife deep enough to finish the job. "Who's behind this?" Cedric didn't turn from the window. "I don't know yet, But it's sophisticated. Multiple moving pieces coordinated across different financial institutions. Then find out. Cedric's reflection in the glass was expressionless. And Marcus? Start liquidating the secondary holdings. Quietly. I want cash reserves built within 2 weeks. That will cost us significantly in forced sales. I didn't ask for your opinion on the economics. I gave you an instruction. Marcus bowed slightly and left. Cedric remained at the window for several minutes after his advisor departed. The rage he'd felt initially had crystallized into something colder and far more useful. Someone was trying to destroy him financially, and they were competent enough to strike at structural weak points he hadn't adequately protected. That level of inside knowledge suggested betrayal. The question was whose? Sati. The answer began to reveal itself that evening at the Pemberton estate, where Cedric had been invited to a private dinner with several parliamentary allies. The invitation itself was unusual. Edward Pemberton was a useful political tool, but hardly a confidant. They'd worked together on railway legislation and mining regulations, trading votes and influence like cards in a game neither particularly enjoyed but both understood. Cedric arrived exactly on time, which in aristocratic circles was a subtle power play. Early suggested eagerness. Late suggested disrespect. Precisely punctual implied you valued neither their time nor your own above the transaction at hand. The Pemberton butler showed him to a private dining room where 5 men waited around a table set for 6. Cedric recognized each of them immediately. Lord Edward Pemberton, Sir Richard Halverson, Count Marcus Vale, Lord Henry Ashford, and Lord Nathaniel Thorne. Cedric felt something cold settle in his chest at the sight of Nathaniel. The man was Marcus Thorne's older brother, a decorated military commander who'd retired from service to manage the family's considerable holdings. The Thornes had been aligned with Blackthorne interests for years, their fortunes intertwined through multiple business ventures. Seeing Nathaniel here, at a dinner Cedric hadn't known would include him, was like watching a chess piece move into attack position. "Gentlemen," Cedric said smoothly, taking his seat, "what an unexpected pleasure to find such esteemed company gathered." The formalities were observed. Wine was poured. Servants brought the first course. But the atmosphere in the room was wrong. The conversation was too careful, like men walking through a room filled with broken glass in the dark. They were waiting for something. Cedric let them wait. He ate methodically, participated in the surface-level discussion about parliamentary politics and trade policy, and watched each man for tells. Pemberton kept glancing at Ashford. Halverson drank too much too quickly. Vale barely touched his food. Only Nathaniel Thorne seemed perfectly at ease. Finally, after the main course was cleared, Pemberton cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we asked you here tonight because we're concerned." "About?" Cedric's tone was polite ice. "Your recent financial difficulties." Pemberton tried to make it sound sympathetic and failed completely. "We've heard troubling rumors. Rumors are the province of servants and journalists, Edward, neither of which are represented at this table, I assume." That got a few uncomfortable laughs. "Of course not," Pemberton said quickly. "But when those rumors involve someone of your stature, someone whose stability affects so many interconnected interests, well, we felt it prudent to offer support." "How generous." Cedric set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "What form would this support take?" Nathaniel Thorne spoke for the first time. "Consolidation, Your Grace?" Cedric turned his attention to the military man. "Explain. Your northern holdings are vast, but, if I may speak frankly, inefficiently managed." Nathaniel's voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding men in combat. "Too much capital tied up in speculative ventures. Too much exposure to volatile shipping markets. We're proposing a restructuring that would stabilize your position considerably. In exchange for partnership." Nathaniel smiled, and it was the smile of a predator that had cornered wounded prey. "We would assume joint control of the troubled assets, inject the capital needed to resolve your immediate liquidity crisis, and share in the profits once stability is restored." "Joint control," Cedric repeated softly. "Of my holdings. Of the troubled assets specifically. The profitable core of your empire would remain entirely under your authority, naturally." Naturally. The room had gone very quiet. Cedric could hear his own heartbeat, slow and steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. They weren't offering help. They were demanding surrender dressed as salvation. and they'd engineered the crisis specifically to force this moment. Cedric looked at each man in turn. Pemberton wouldn't meet his eyes. Halverson stared at his plate. Vale looked vaguely sick. Ashford had the decency to look defiant at least, like he believed he was doing something noble by participating in this. Only Nathaniel held Cedric's gaze without flinching. "Gentlemen," Cedric said quietly, "I appreciate your concern, truly, but I'm afraid I must decline your generous offer. Your Grace—" Pemberton started. I wasn't finished. Cedric's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a blade through silk. "You've made a fundamental miscalculation. You looked at my current difficulties and assumed I was weak. You orchestrated this crisis, called in loans, leaked information to the press, and manufactured pressure, all while believing I wouldn't see the architecture of the trap." He stood slowly, every movement controlled. "But here's what you failed to understand. I built my empire on one immutable principle. Fear is more reliable than loyalty because fear doesn't require affection or trust. It only requires consistency, and I've been nothing if not consistent in how I deal with betrayal." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. "You think I'm vulnerable?" Cedric smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing most of these men had ever seen. "I'm about to teach you the difference between wounded and cornered." He walked to the door, then paused. "Oh, and Nathaniel, tell your brother Marcus that his services are no longer required. He should leave Blackthorn Manor before I return tonight. If he's still there when I arrive, I'll have him arrested for embezzlement. The evidence is already compiled." Nathaniel's expression flickered for the first time. "That's impossible," he said, but he didn't sound certain. "Is it?" Cedric opened the door. "I've spent 10 years building systems to protect my interests. Did you really think your brother's betrayal would go unnoticed? The only question was whether I'd tolerate it or punish it. You've just answered that question for me." He left before anyone could respond. The carriage ride back to Blackthorn Manor took 40 minutes. Cedric spent 38 of them sitting in absolute silence, his mind working through implications and countermoves with mechanical precision. The last 2 minutes he spent on rage. Pure, crystallized, murderous rage. They'd tried to destroy him. Not quickly, not honestly, but through financial strangulation and manufactured crisis. They'd counted on his pride to blind him, his reputation for ruthlessness to isolate him, his lack of genuine allies to leave him vulnerable. They'd counted on him being the monster everyone believed he was. They were right about that part. But they'd forgotten that monsters don't surrender. They burn everything down. By morning, Marcus Thorne had disappeared from London entirely. Smart man. Cedric's investigation had uncovered exactly what he'd suspected. A pattern of small embezzlements stretched over 18 months. Each transaction perfectly legal on paper but designed to weaken Blackthorn Holdings at critical moments. Marcus had been selling information to his brother the entire time. Cedric stood in his study reviewing the compiled evidence when his head of security, a former intelligence officer named James Cartwright, entered with an update. "The Ashford loans have been transferred to a holding company registered in the Channel Islands," Cartwright reported. "We can't trace the ownership, but the timing suggests coordination with last night's dinner." "Let them hide," Cedric said. "I want you to focus on something else." "Sir?" "The conspiracy. This goes deeper than Nathaniel Thorne and a few nervous lords. Someone with serious capital and political connections is orchestrating this. Find out who." Cartwright hesitated. "Your Grace, if I may, the methods required to extract that information might be—" He searched for the right word. "Aggressive." Cedric looked at his security chief with eyes that had lost any pretense of civility. "I didn't hire you to be gentle, James. I hired you because you understand that sometimes the only way to stop a knife is to break the hand holding it. Use whatever methods are necessary. Just be discreet. Understood, Your Grace?" After Cartwright left, Cedric walked to the window again. It had become a habit these past weeks, standing here and looking out over the city like a general surveying a battlefield, which, he supposed, was exactly what it had become. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. 10 years ago, he'd been a younger son of a minor noble house with no real prospects and unlimited rage. His father had drunk away the family fortune. His older brother had died in a pointless duel over a woman who wasn't worth the bullet. And Cedric had inherited nothing but debt and a title that meant less than the paper it was written on. So he'd built something new. He'd started with money borrowed from sources polite society didn't acknowledge. Use that capital to buy distressed assets no one else wanted. Rail stations in dying industrial towns. Shipping contracts to dangerous ports. Mining rights in territories where workers died faster than they could be replaced. He'd built his empire on the bones of desperate people making desperate choices. And he'd done it without apology or hesitation because the world had taught him that mercy was just another word for weakness. And weakness was death. Now that empire was under assault, and the men trying to destroy it thought they were doing something noble. They thought they were taking down a tyrant. They looked at Cedric's ruthlessness and convinced themselves they were heroes for opposing him. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Amultium. 3 days later, Lord Henry Ashford's body was found in the Thames. The official report called it suicide. Ashford had been facing financial ruin, his creditors were circling, and he'd apparently thrown himself from Westminster Bridge in the early hours of the morning. There were no witnesses, no suicide note, just a body and convenient assumptions. Cedric read the newspaper report over breakfast and felt nothing. He hadn't ordered Ashford's death, hadn't needed to. Cartwright had simply been instructed to extract information about who was funding the conspiracy, and Cartwright was nothing if not thorough in his work. If Ashford had chosen to jump rather than answer questions, that was his decision. Cedric turned the page and continued eating. The death sent shockwaves through London's aristocracy. Ashford might have been minor nobility, but he was still one of them, and his suspicious suicide opened questions no one wanted to examine too closely. Questions like, what had he been so afraid of that death seemed preferable? The answer came 2 days later when Edward Pemberton appeared at Blackthorn Manor, unannounced and clearly terrified. The butler showed him to Cedric's study, where the Duke was reviewing shipping manifests. Cedric didn't stand or offer refreshment. He simply looked up from his work and waited. Your Grace, Pemberton began, then faltered. Edward. Cedric's voice was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You come to my home without invitation during business hours. This must be urgent. I want out! The words tumbled from Pemberton like a confession. The conspiracy. Whatever Nathaniel is planning, I want no part of it. How admirable! Cedric set down his pen with careful precision. Tell me, Edward, when exactly did your conscience develop? Was it before or after Henry Ashford's body was pulled from the river? Pemberton went pale. I had nothing to do with that. No? You were at the dinner where we discussed destroying my holdings. You were part of the coordination that manufactured my financial crisis. But you had nothing to do with the consequences when a co-conspirator decided death was preferable to whatever questions were being asked? Pemberton's hands shook. I made a mistake. No, Cedric corrected him. You made a choice. You looked at my supposed vulnerability and decided to profit from it. The mistake was believing I wouldn't survive long enough to collect payment. He stood and walked around the desk, each step deliberate. Here's what's going to happen, Edward. You're going to tell me everything. Who organized the conspiracy? Who provided the capital? What the endgame was supposed to be? Every detail, every name, every meeting you attended. And if I refuse? Cedric smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd stopped pretending to be human. Then James Cartwright will ask you the same questions Henry Ashford was asked, and we'll see if you're braver than he was. Pemberton broke. It took less than an hour for him to spill everything he knew. The conspiracy was broader than Cedric had suspected, involving not just British aristocrats but foreign investors looking to seize control of England's rail infrastructure. Nathaniel Thorne was the public face, but the real power belonged to someone Pemberton only knew as the architect. A man who'd been planning this for years. A man who knew Cedric's operations intimately. A man who'd once been his closest advisor. The name, when Pemberton finally said it, hit Cedric like a physical blow. Lord Cedric Marrow. Cedric actually laughed. The sound was hollow and humorless, but it filled the study like broken glass. Marrow. Of course it was Marrow. Lord Cedric Marrow had been Blackthorn's chief political strategist for 8 years. The man who'd helped him navigate Parliament, broker alliances, and destroy enemies with surgical precision. They'd built the Northern Empire together, two ruthless minds working in perfect synchronization, and Cedric had trusted him, or as close to trust as someone like Cedric could manage. Where is he now? Cedric's voice had gone dangerously quiet. I don't know, Pemberton said quickly. He operates through intermediaries. I've never met with him directly. But you've communicated. Through encrypted correspondence. dead drops in various locations around London. Show me. Yes. It took 3 days to trace Merrow's network. The man was brilliant, Cedric had to admit. He'd built an entire shadow organization designed to dismantle Blackthorn Holdings piece by piece, using legitimate financial instruments and political pressure instead of violence. It was elegant. It was sophisticated. It would have worked on anyone else. But Cedric wasn't anyone else. He'd spent a decade studying power in its rawest forms, learning to read betrayal in the space between words, understanding that the most dangerous knife was always the one you didn't see coming. Merrow had taught him that lesson personally. Now Cedric was going to return the education. The Imperial Founders Gala was scheduled for the following week, an annual event where the most powerful families in the Empire gathered to celebrate themselves with obscene displays of wealth. Attendance was mandatory for anyone who mattered politically, which meant Merrow would be there. Cedric spent those 7 days preparing. He liquidated secondary assets, called in favors from sources even his enemies didn't know existed, and built a trap so comprehensive that Merrow would walk into it thinking he'd already won. Because the beautiful thing about brilliant people was their belief in their own brilliance. They could see every move except the one that came from someone willing to sacrifice everything just to watch them burn. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in London fog and false civility. Westminster Hall glittered with enough candles to illuminate a cathedral, and the aristocracy flowed through its marble corridors like blood through veins. Cedric arrived alone, which drew immediate attention. A duke of his stature should have arrived with an entourage, with mistresses or political allies or at least enough servants to suggest importance. Instead, he walked through the grand entrance by himself, wearing formal attire that cost more than most men earned in a year, and his isolation was more menacing than any crowd could have been. People moved out of his path without conscious thought. The monster was here. Cedric found Merrow in the main ballroom, surrounded by admirers and sycophants, holding court like he was royalty instead of hired help who'd gotten too ambitious. The man looked healthy, confident, and completely at ease. That would change. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. Two men who'd built an empire together. Two minds that understood power in ways most people never would. Two predators who'd finally turned on each other. Merrow smiled and raised his glass in mock salute. Cedric returned the gesture. Then the doors to Westminster Hall slammed shut with a sound like a coffin closing, and armed men in military uniform entered from 4 different entrances simultaneously. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Screams echoed off marble walls as aristocrats tried to flee through exits that were already blocked. Ministers grabbed for their security details only to find half of them unresponsive, bought and paid for weeks ago. The music stopped mid-note, and Cedric walked through the center of the pandemonium like he was strolling through a garden, his path aimed directly at Merrow. The conspiracy struck according to plan. Merrow's men moved to secure the room, separate the key political targets, and extract the Duke's remaining allies for elimination. It was textbook military efficiency applied to political execution. But Cedric had read the same textbooks. The first of Merrow's men to reach him died with a ceremonial dagger through the throat. Cedric had moved so fast that half the room didn't see the strike, just the body dropping and the Duke continuing forward without breaking stride. The second man hesitated, and that hesitation was fatal. Cedric broke his arm at the elbow, took his pistol, and shot the third attacker before the second had finished falling. Then he kept walking. Merrow's expression shifted from confident to concerned to terrified in the space of seconds. He backed toward the far wall as Cedric crossed the ballroom, stepping over bodies and through spreading pools of blood with the steady inevitability of an execution. "You were unstoppable when you belonged to no one," Merrow shouted across the chaos. "But you got soft, Cedric. You started to care about legacy, about what history would say, about being more than just a butcher in expensive clothes." Cedric reached the council table where treaties and territorial maps were displayed as decoration for the gala. He drove the bloody dagger through the center of the largest map, pinning it to the polished wood. "No," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the entire hall. "I was merely empty." More of Merrow's men were pouring in now, but so were Cedric's own forces. The security personnel he'd spent 3 days bribing, blackmailing, and buying. The military units loyal to houses he'd saved from destruction years ago. The underground elements whose debts he'd called in all at once. The battle transformed Westminster Hall into a war zone, Gunfire shattered crystal chandeliers and sent glass raining down on marble floors. Ministers fled through corridors that led to locked doors and armed checkpoints. Smoke began to fill the hall as someone set fire to the parliamentary documents stored in the adjacent chambers. Through it all, Cedric hunted Marrow with single-minded focus. He found him in one of the side galleries, trying to escape through a servant's entrance that had already been sealed. Marrow turned to face him, and for the first time, Cedric saw genuine fear in his former advisor's eyes. "You can't kill me," Marrow said desperately. "I have information, evidence of every illegal thing you've ever done. If I die, it all becomes public." Cedric tilted his head slightly, considering. "You really think I care? Your reputation is built on fear, not approval." Cedric stepped closer. "You taught me that, remember? You sat in my study 8 years ago and told me that power doesn't require love or respect. It only requires the certainty that opposing you will cost more than submission. This was different. This was treason. This was you trying to destroy everything we built because you convinced yourself you deserved to rule instead of serve. And the problem with that plan, old friend, is that you forgot what I am." He was close enough now to touch Marrow, and the older man pressed himself against the wall like he could disappear into it. "I'm not soft," Cedric continued. "I'm not weakened by conscience or limited by morality. I'm exactly what you made me. A weapon aimed at anyone stupid enough to stand in my way. And you just put yourself in front of me." Marrow tried to speak, but Cedric's hand closed around his throat. The struggle was brief. Marrow clawed at Cedric's arm, tried to knee him, attempted every desperate move of a man fighting for his life. But Cedric had spent 10 years becoming something more than human, something that didn't flinch at violence or hesitate when the moment required absolute commitment. He squeezed until Marrow stopped moving. Then he squeezed a little longer, just to be sure. When he released the body, letting it crumple to the expensive carpet, Cedric felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just the cold certainty that the problem was solved. He walked back into the main hall where the battle was winding down. His forces had secured the key positions. Marrow's conspirators were either dead, captured, or fleeing into a London night where Cedric's people controlled every exit point that mattered. It was over. Westminster Hall looked like a battlefield. Bodies lay scattered across the marble floors. Blood pooled beneath overturned furniture. Smoke hung in the air thick enough to choke on. And standing in the center of it all, untouched by the carnage he'd orchestrated, was Duke Cedric Blackthorne. The surviving aristocrats stared at him with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters and acts of God. He'd just torn apart a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful families in England. He'd killed a former lord in front of Parliament's most influential members. He'd transformed the social event of the season into a massacre, and he'd done it without raising his voice or losing his composure. One of the captured conspirators, a young count named Richard Halverson, who'd been at the dinner 3 weeks ago, started laughing. It was the high, broken sound of a mind that had shattered under pressure. "You're a monster," Halverson said through the laughter. "You're not even human anymore." Cedric walked toward him slowly, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. "No," he agreed, "I'm not." Then he gestured to Cartwright. "Make sure the surviving conspirators understand the terms of their continued existence. Full disclosure of all assets, complete cooperation with our investigation, and permanent exile from London. Anyone who refuses gets handed over to the Crown for treason charges." The prisoners went very quiet. "Your Grace," one of the ministers who'd been trapped in the hall spoke up hesitantly. "The Crown will want an accounting of tonight's events. Then they can have one." Cedric turned to face the man. "Tell them Lord Cedric Marrow attempted a coup using foreign capital and corrupted aristocrats. Tell them I stopped it. Tell them the evidence is extensive, and the conspiracy went deeper than anyone suspected. Tell them whatever you like." He smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd just burned the world down and found he didn't miss the ashes. "Just make sure they understand that Blackthorne territory is under my protection, and anyone who challenges that will discover exactly how creative I can be with definitions of justice." No one argued. Dawn found Cedric standing on the balcony of Blackthorne Manor, looking out over a London that was just beginning to wake to news of the previous night's events. The morning papers would call it everything from a foiled coup to a gangland massacre, depending on which editor was brave enough to print what. The truth would be buried beneath layers of political convenience and aristocratic embarrassment, which suited Cedric perfectly. Cartwright appeared in the doorway behind him. "Your Grace, we've completed the initial sweep, found something you need to see." Cedric followed his security chief to the study where a leather-bound journal lay open on the desk. Marrow's personal records recovered from his private residence before the authorities could seize them. Cedric read the pages with growing cold fury. The conspiracy had been more extensive than even Pemberton had known. Marrow hadn't just planned to destroy Blackthorn Holdings. He'd been building a shadow government, using foreign capital to corrupt British institutions from the inside out. Rail companies, shipping empires, mining operations, all the industrial infrastructure that made England a global power. And at the center of it, linking everything together, was one name that appeared again and again in the margins. Lady Seraphine Vale. Cedric stared at the name like it was written in a language he couldn't quite parse. Seraphine Vale was the daughter of a declining noble house drowning in debt. He'd met her exactly once, at a parliamentary function 2 months ago, and she'd been the only woman in the room who'd looked at him with calculation instead of fear or fascination. He'd found it refreshing. Now he was reading her name in the diary of a dead traitor. "Who is she, really?" Cedric asked Cartwright. The security chief pulled out a file that was notably thick for someone supposedly minor nobility. "Lady Seraphine Vale, 26, educated at private schools on the continent, speaks 4 languages fluently, returned to London 3 years ago when her father's gambling debts reached critical levels. And her connection to Marrow? Unclear. Her name appears frequently, but never with context. Could be a co-conspirator, could be a target, could be something else entirely." Cedric closed the journal slowly. "Find her. Discreetly. I want to know everything about her before I decide whether she's a problem that needs solving." Cartwright nodded and left. Cedric returned to the balcony and the rising sun painting London gold and red. The empire he'd built on fear was intact, his enemies were destroyed, and his position was more secure than ever. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt empty, because Marrow had been right about one thing. Cedric had become so focused on power that he'd forgotten why he wanted it in the first place. He'd spent 10 years building an empire of fear, and now he stood alone at the top of it, surrounded by people who obeyed him and no one who knew him. The loneliness was absolute. And somewhere in London, a woman whose name appeared in a dead man's diary was either his next enemy or something else entirely. Cedric didn't know which option frightened him more. The message arrived 3 days later. It was hand-delivered to Blackthorn Manor by a street urchin who disappeared before Cartwright could question him. The envelope was expensive paper sealed with wax that bore no family crest. Inside was a single card with 4 words written in elegant script. "We need to talk." It was signed simply S. Vale. Cedric stared at the card for a long time. Every instinct he'd honed over 10 years of survival screamed that this was a trap. The daughter of a broken house didn't casually summon a duke unless she had leverage, protection, or a death wish. But her name had been in Marrow's journal, and Cedric needed to know why. He sent a reply through the same channels. "Tomorrow night, Blackthorn Manor. Come alone." The response came within hours. "Only if you do the same." Cedric smiled despite himself. She had nerve, at least. That evening, he stood in his study preparing for a meeting that could be anything from a negotiation to an assassination attempt. Cartwright had wanted to station guards throughout the house, but Cedric had refused. If Seraphine Vale was brave enough to walk into his home alone, the least he could do was grant her the same courtesy. Besides, he was curious. The woman who'd looked at the monster and seen something worth calculating. The name in a dead traitor's diary. The aristocrat summoning a duke. Tomorrow night, he'd discover whether she was another enemy to destroy or something far more dangerous. Someone who understood exactly what he was and didn't look away. The clock struck midnight, and Cedric stood alone in Blackthorn Manor, surrounded by an empire built on fear and ashes, waiting to meet the only person in London foolish enough or brilliant enough to demand his attention. Outside, the city slept. Inside, the monster waited to see if he'd finally met his match. What happens when the woman who sees through your armor walks into your fortress? What happens when she knows exactly what you are and sits down anyway? What happens when the hunter realizes he's been studying prey that was studying him right back? Tomorrow night, Duke Cedric Blackthorn would find out, and nothing would ever be the same. The night air carried fog thick enough to taste, and somewhere in the distance, London's church bells marked the hour with sounds that felt like warnings. Cedric stood in the main hall of Blackthorn Manor waiting for a woman who had no business demanding his time, but had done it anyway. The audacity alone was worth investigating. He'd positioned himself near the fireplace, not because he needed warmth, but because the light would hit his face at an angle that made reading his expressions nearly impossible. Small advantage, but he'd learned years ago that small advantages compounded into survival when everything else went to hell. Cartwright had wanted to search her before entry. Cedric had refused. If Seraphine Vale was stupid enough to walk into his home armed, he'd know within 30 seconds of her arrival. And if she was smart enough to come unarmed into the monster's den, well, that told him something far more useful than what weapons she might carry. The clock struck 9. At 9:02, the front doors opened and she walked in like she owned the place. That was the first surprise. Most people approaching Blackthorn Manor for the first time moved with hesitation, their bodies betraying awareness that they were entering territory controlled by someone more dangerous than they'd ever be. The smart ones showed deference. The stupid ones showed bravado. Seraphine Vale showed neither. She crossed the threshold with the steady confidence of someone who'd already calculated every risk and decided the meeting was worth it. Her dress was expensive but understated, dark green fabric that suggested wealth without screaming it. No jewelry except a single ring on her right hand. Hair pulled back in a style that was practical rather than decorative. She looked like a woman preparing for negotiation, not seduction. Cedric revised his initial assessment upward. Your Grace. Her voice was steady, no tremor, no artificial warmth. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't see you, Cedric corrected. You demanded a meeting, and I was curious enough to allow it. Those are different things. She smiled slightly. Fair distinction. He gestured toward the chairs arranged near the fireplace. Sit, or don't. But if we're doing this, let's be efficient about it. Seraphine moved to the chair opposite his and sat with posture that suggested finishing school and iron discipline. She didn't fidget, didn't look around the room with obvious curiosity, just settled in and waited. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Most people couldn't tolerate silence. They filled it with nervous chatter or false pleasantries, revealing more in their discomfort than they ever would through deliberate speech. Cedric had used that weakness to destroy careers and extract confessions from men who thought they were cleverer than they were. Seraphine just sat there, apparently content to wait until he decided to begin. Interesting. Your name appears in Lord Marrow's private journals, Cedric said finally. Multiple times. Care to explain why a dead traitor was documenting your existence? Because he was trying to use me. Her answer came without hesitation. My family's debt made us vulnerable, and he approached my father 6 months ago with an offer. Financial relief in exchange for cooperation with certain business interests that aligned with his goals. And you said? I said my father was a gambling addict with no head for strategy, and if Marrow wanted Vale cooperation, he'd need to negotiate with someone who understood what was actually being offered. Cedric felt something like respect beginning to form, which was annoying because respect made things complicated. So you met with him. Twice. Seraphine's gaze was direct, unflinching. The first time, he outlined a plan to acquire controlling interest in several rail companies through leveraged buyouts and political pressure. The second time, he told me the real target was Blackthorn Holdings and asked if I'd be willing to provide intelligence on parliamentary vulnerabilities. And you said? I said I'd think about it. Then I started investigating who Marrow really was and what he was actually building. She leaned forward slightly, and the firelight caught her face in a way that made her look older than her years. Harder. I grew up watching my father destroy everything we had because he couldn't tell the difference between calculated risk and desperate stupidity. I wasn't going to make the same mistake by trusting a man whose entire plan required betraying someone with your reputation for creative violence. So you refused him. I did better than that. I documented everything. Every meeting, every proposal, every name he mentioned. Kept records of the whole conspiracy in case I needed leverage later. Leverage against who? Whoever survived. She said it like it was obvious. Marrow if he won. You if you destroyed him first. I didn't particularly care which outcome occurred, as long as I positioned myself to be useful to the winner, rather than a liability that needed eliminating. Cedric studied her face for signs of deception and found none. Just cold pragmatism delivered with the same tone someone might use discussing weather patterns or market trends. You're telling me you documented a treason conspiracy and kept it secret hoping to sell the information afterward. I'm telling you I recognized a war between powerful men and made sure I'd survive it regardless of who won. Seraphine met his gaze without blinking. My father taught me something useful before the gambling destroyed his brain. In a world where power is the only currency that matters, the survivor isn't the strongest or the smartest. It's whoever understands the game well enough to make themselves valuable to people who can afford to keep them alive. And you think you're valuable to me. I know I am, because I have documentation of everyone involved in Merrow's conspiracy, including 3 names that weren't in his journals. People who funded the operation from overseas. People whose continued involvement in British infrastructure would be, let's call it, problematic for your interests. Cedric's expression didn't change, but his mind was already working through implications. If she actually had that information, it was worth more than gold. Foreign interference in England's industrial development was the kind of scandal that could bring down governments and destroy dynasties. It was also the kind of information that got people killed. Why bring this to me now, he asked. You could have sold it to the Crown, to Parliament, to any number of people who'd paid generously for intelligence like that, because they'd pay once and then I'd become a problem that needed silencing. Seraphine's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was explaining basic mathematics to a slow student. You, on the other hand, have a reputation for keeping useful people alive as long as they remain useful, and I'm very good at remaining useful. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Cedric watched this woman who'd walked into his fortress alone and essentially admitted to playing both sides of a conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. She should have been terrified, should have been begging or negotiating or showing some sign that she understood the danger she was in. Instead, she sat there looking like she was waiting for him to catch up to a conclusion she'd reached weeks ago. Show me, he said finally. Seraphine reached into a pocket hidden in her dress and produced a small key. The documents are in a lockbox at Barings Bank under a false name. This opens it. You can verify the contents yourself. He took the key, their fingers not quite touching. And if I find nothing but blank pages, then you'll kill me and I'll have miscalculated badly. She said it without drama, just acknowledgement of obvious consequences. But I didn't come here to die, Your Grace. I came here to negotiate. Negotiate what exactly? My family's survival. Seraphine folded her hands in her lap with deliberate care. The Vale name is drowning in debt accumulated through 3 generations of spectacularly poor decisions. We have nothing left but the title and a house that's falling apart around us. Merrow offered to clear the debt in exchange for cooperation. I'm offering you something better, which is documentation that protects your interests. Intelligence networks my family still maintains throughout Europe despite our financial collapse, and someone who understands how to navigate aristocratic politics without the sentimentality that makes most nobles useless in actual crisis. She paused, and something shifted in her expression. Something that looked almost like vulnerability but vanished too quickly to be certain. In exchange, you clear my family's debt and give me a position where I can actually use my skills instead of watching my father sell off heirlooms to pay for his next card game. Cedric laughed. The sound was harsh and humorless. You want me to pay your family's debts and employ you, in exchange for information I could extract through other means if I felt sufficiently motivated. You could try. Seraphine's tone didn't change. But I've prepared for that possibility too. The documents I'm offering have a failsafe. If I don't check in with my solicitor every 72 hours, everything gets delivered to the London Times, the Crown, and several parliamentary committees simultaneously. Public scandal might not destroy you, but it would certainly complicate your operations for months. She was blackmailing him. This woman had walked into his home alone and was calmly outlining the consequences of torturing or killing her like she was discussing terms of a business contract. The sheer brass balls required for that maneuver was almost impressive enough to make him forget he should probably be insulted. You're betting I'll find keeping you alive more convenient than dealing with the mess your death would create. I'm betting you're smart enough to recognize an asset when it presents itself. Seraphine met his gaze with eyes that held no fear, no uncertainty, nothing but cold calculation. Merrow failed because he underestimated you. I'm succeeding because I estimated you exactly right. You don't want loyalty or admiration or any of the other things people usually offer powerful men. You want competence, utility, someone who understands the game and plays it well enough to be worth the investment. And you think you're that person. I know I am. Because I'm sitting in your study after exposing myself as a potential traitor, and instead of having me killed, you're listening to my offer. Which means part of you already knows I'm right. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney. Cedric stood slowly and walked to the window overlooking the grounds. Behind him, he heard Seraphine shift slightly, but she didn't speak. She was right, which was annoying. Everything she'd said made cold, logical sense. If her information was genuine, it was valuable enough to justify the cost of clearing Vale debts. And if she was half as competent as she claimed, having someone who understood aristocratic politics without the usual moral squeamishness could be useful. But it was the other thing, the unspoken element beneath the transaction. She'd looked at him the way everyone else did, seen the monster everyone else saw, and instead of running or trying to change him, she'd calculated how to make herself indispensable to exactly what he was. That kind of clear-eyed pragmatism was rarer than gold and twice as dangerous. "I'll verify your information," Cedric said without turning from the window. "If it's as valuable as you claim, I'll clear your family's debt and give you a position in my organization. If you've wasted my time or the intelligence is compromised, I'll make sure your death is instructive enough that no one else tries this particular gambit. Understood?" No hesitation in her voice. "And Seraphine?" He turned to face her. "If you work for me, you work for me completely. No divided loyalties, no secret agendas, no plans to play both sides if another conflict emerges. I don't tolerate betrayal even once, and you've already used up your allowance of clever duplicity by documenting Marrow's conspiracy. I don't need another allowance." She stood smoothly. "I need a patron powerful enough that betting against him would be suicidal stupidity. You're that patron, assuming you're smart enough to accept what I'm offering. Get out." His voice was flat. "You'll have my answer within 48 hours." Seraphine walked to the door with the same confidence she'd entered with. She paused at the threshold and looked back. "Your Grace? One more thing." "What?" "Marrow failed because he wanted to replace you. I'm succeeding because I don't." Her expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I don't want your empire. I don't want your reputation. I just want to survive in a world where survival requires being useful to people who have the power to protect their assets." She left before he could respond. Cedric stood alone in the study, listening to her footsteps fade down the corridor. Then he looked at the key she'd given him, small and ordinary and potentially worth more than everything else in the room combined. Cartwright appeared in the doorway moments later. "Well?" his security chief asked. "Follow her, discreetly. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she speaks to, and whether she contacts anyone after leaving here. And the documents at Barings Bank? We verify them tomorrow, personally. If she's telling the truth, we move forward. If she's lying..." Cedric smiled without humor. "Then we discover whether her failsafe is real or another bluff." After Cartwright left, Cedric returned to the window. Somewhere out there in London's fog, Seraphine Vale was either the most useful asset he'd encountered in years or the most sophisticated threat he'd ever faced. The problem was he couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty was more unsettling than anything that had happened since Marrow's conspiracy had tried to destroy him. The documents were real. Cedric verified them personally the next morning at Barings Bank, and what he found in that lockbox made his blood run cold for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with opportunity. Seraphine hadn't exaggerated. She'd documented everything: names, dates, financial transactions, meeting locations. 3 foreign investors from German industrial families with ties to their government. 2 British lords who'd escaped the conspiracy purge because their involvement had been buried deep enough that even Marrow's journals hadn't exposed them. And most valuable of all, evidence of a secondary plan. A backup conspiracy designed to activate if the first attempt failed. They weren't done trying to destroy him, they'd just paused to regroup. Cedric sat in the bank's private viewing room reading page after page of meticulous intelligence gathering and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine surprise. Seraphine Vale had done this herself. No hired investigators, no paid informants, just her own observation and analysis turned into documentation comprehensive enough to hang a dozen powerful men. She'd walked into a conspiracy, pretended to consider cooperation, and systematically recorded everything while maintaining cover deep enough that no one suspected her. That level of deception required extraordinary nerve and even more extraordinary judgment. It also required someone who understood power in ways most people never would. Someone who looked at the world the same way Cedric did. as a battlefield where survival went to whoever played the game most ruthlessly. He returned to Blackthorn Manor and sent for her immediately. She arrived within the hour, wearing a different dress, but the same expression of controlled calculation. "The information is genuine," Cedric said without preamble. "Your family's debt will be cleared by the end of the week. You'll receive a formal position as a political advisor with access to confidential correspondence and parliamentary intelligence." "Thank you, Your Grace. Don't thank me yet." He leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "You've just made yourself valuable enough to keep alive, but also valuable enough that losing you would be problematic. Which means from this moment forward, you're a target for anyone who wants to hurt me. I'm aware of the risk. Are you? Because the people you've just exposed aren't going to respond with lawsuits and stern letters. They're going to respond with hired killers and manufactured accidents. Your life just became exponentially more dangerous. Then I suppose it's fortunate I've aligned myself with someone who has a vested interest in keeping me breathing." Seraphine's expression didn't change. "Besides, my life was already dangerous. Poverty kills just as effectively as assassins. It just takes longer and hurts more." Cedric found himself almost smiling despite his better judgment. "You really don't fear me at all, do you?" "I fear what you could do to me. I just fear what the world would do to me without your protection more." She said it simply, like stating a mathematical equation, and Cedric realized she was telling the truth. This wasn't bravado or stupidity. It was pure survival instinct channeled into cold pragmatism. She'd looked at her options and chosen the monster because the monster was more useful than the alternatives. "There's something else," Cedric said. "The documents mention a secondary conspiracy. Details are thin, but it's clear they're planning another attempt." "I know." Seraphine pulled a folded paper from inside her sleeve. "I've been tracking the communication patterns. There's a meeting scheduled for next week at the Ashworth estate. 5 key players attempting to reorganize what Marrow started." "How do you know this?" "Because I maintained my cover. As far as they know, I'm still a potential recruit who got cold feet after Marrow's death. One of them reached out yesterday testing whether I'd reconsider cooperation now that the conspiracy has new leadership. And you said?" "That I'd need more information before committing, which bought me an invitation to the preliminary meeting as an observer." She handed him the paper. Names, location, expected attendees. Cedric read it and felt the familiar cold focus settling over him. This was an opportunity. A chance to identify and eliminate the secondary conspiracy before it could truly organize. But it was also insanely dangerous. "They'll be watching you," he said. "One mistake, one suspicious question, and you'll be exposed." "I'm aware." Her voice remained steady. "But if I can maintain cover long enough to identify the full network, you can dismantle it permanently instead of just cutting off the visible pieces. You're volunteering to walk into a room full of people who want me destroyed and pretend to consider helping them. I'm volunteering to do exactly what you'd do if you could." Seraphine met his gaze directly. "Use deception as a weapon. Gather intelligence while appearing harmless. Position yourself to strike when the moment provides maximum advantage." She was describing his own tactics back to him with perfect accuracy. It was deeply unsettling. "If you get caught," Cedric said quietly, "I won't be able to protect you. They'll kill you before I could reach you. Then I won't get caught." The certainty in her voice wasn't arrogance. It was the same cold assessment he used when calculating acceptable risks versus potential gains. She really was exactly what she'd claimed to be. Someone who understood the game and played it without sentiment or hesitation. "Fine," he said finally. "You go to the meeting, but you wear a wire, and Cartwright positions surveillance outside the estate. First sign of trouble, we extract you by force if necessary." "Agreed." "And Seraphine?" His tone dropped to something harder. "If this is a trap, if you're playing a longer game than I'm seeing, understand that I will find out. And what happened to Marrow will look like mercy compared to what I'll do to you." She didn't flinch. "If I wanted you dead, Your Grace, I wouldn't have given you intelligence that makes me valuable. I'd have given you false information designed to walk you into an ambush. The fact that everything I've provided has been accurate should tell you what you need to know about my intentions." She was right again, which was becoming a pattern. "Get out," Cedric said. "Prepare for the meeting. Cartwright will coordinate the security details." Seraphine left without another word. Cedric sat alone in his study and realized he'd just agreed to send a woman he barely knew into the heart of a conspiracy specifically designed to destroy him, based on nothing more than her apparent competence and his own assessment that she was too smart to betray him this early. It was possibly the stupidest tactical decision he'd made in years, or the most brilliant. He honestly couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty was starting to feel like a pattern where Seraphine Vale was concerned. But back. The week passed in tense preparation. Cartwright positioned surveillance teams around the Ashworth estate. Seraphine studied backgrounds on every expected attendee, memorizing details that might prove useful in maintaining her cover. Cedric watched her work and tried to ignore the growing awareness that he was developing something dangerously close to trust. Trust was weakness. Trust created vulnerability. He'd built his entire empire on the principle that trusting anyone was just delayed suicide. But Seraphine didn't ask for trust. She provided value and expected reciprocal value in return. Pure transaction, no sentiment involved. That should have made it easier. It didn't. The night of the meeting arrived wrapped in rain that turned London's streets into flowing rivers of mud and runoff. Seraphine dressed in mourning colors, explaining that it would position her as someone still grieving the loss of opportunity Marrow's death represented. The psychology was sound. People trusted grief because it seemed honest. She left Blackthorn Manor at 7, traveling by hired carriage to avoid any connection to Cedric's household. Cartwright and his team followed at a distance, invisible in the storm. Cedric remained at the manor, listening to reports through the communication system Cartwright had established. He should have been reviewing other business, managing the dozen crises that always demanded attention when running an empire. Instead, he sat in his study and waited, his focus entirely on a woman walking into danger at his instruction. The wire she wore transmitted clearly despite the weather. Cedric heard her arrive at the Ashworth estate, heard the murmured greetings as she was welcomed inside, heard the rustle of fabric as she was led to a private room where the conspirators waited. Then he heard their voices, and his blood went cold. Not because he recognized them, though he did, because one of them was Lord Richard Pemberton, the same Pemberton who'd broken under pressure 3 weeks ago and provided intelligence about Marrow's conspiracy. The same Pemberton who'd supposedly withdrawn from all conspiratorial activity out of fear. The same Pemberton who was now apparently leading the reorganization effort. Cedric felt rage crystallize into something sharp and focused. Pemberton had played him, had given him partial information designed to satisfy immediate questions while hiding his own deeper involvement. Clever bastard. Through the wire, he heard Seraphine being introduced to the group. 5 men total, all minor nobility with connections to foreign capital and industrial interests that competed with Blackthorn Holdings. And Pemberton was coordinating them. Lady Vale, Pemberton's voice came through clearly. Thank you for joining us. We know this has been a difficult time since Lord Marrow's unfortunate demise. Unfortunate is certainly one word for it. Seraphine's voice carried exactly the right note of bitter resignation. I invested considerable time in those negotiations, only to watch everything collapse into violence. Yes, well. Pemberton sounded sympathetic in a way that made Cedric want to reach through the communication system and strangle him. That's why we're here. To discuss rebuilding what Marrow started, but with better planning and more realistic timelines. What Cedric heard next made him go very still. The new conspiracy wasn't targeting his holdings directly. They'd learned that lesson. Instead, they were planning to corrupt the regulatory framework that governed rail transport, using parliamentary influence to create restrictions that would strangle Blackthorn operations through legal limitations rather than financial warfare. It was sophisticated, it was long-term, and it would be nearly impossible to fight through traditional means because every restriction would be technically legal. Brilliant and infuriating. Through the wire, he heard Seraphine ask careful questions, each one designed to extract maximum information while appearing naturally curious. She was good, better than good. She navigated the conversation like someone who'd been trained in intelligence work, finding pressure points and exploiting them without anyone noticing. Then Pemberton said something that changed everything. Of course, we learned from Marrow's mistakes. He trusted too much in fear and not enough in leverage. We're not going to try to destroy Blackthorn through force. We're going to make him destroy himself through desperation. How? Seraphine asked. By taking away the one thing he values above everything else. Pemberton's voice carried satisfaction that made Cedric's hands curl into fists. His reputation for invincibility. We're going to expose his weaknesses publicly. Show the world that the Duke of Blackthorn is just a man who bleeds like anyone else. What weaknesses? One of the other men sounded skeptical. The man's run his empire like a fortress for 10 years. He has now, Pemberton agreed, but that's changing. He started making decisions based on emotion rather than pure calculation. Protecting the Vale family after Adrian's involvement in the conspiracy. Accepting Seraphine into his organization despite the obvious risk. He's developing attachments, gentlemen, and attachments are weaknesses we can exploit. The room went silent. Cedric felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized what was happening. They weren't just targeting his empire, they were targeting the people around him, using his own recent decisions as evidence that he was vulnerable to emotional manipulation. And they were right. He'd protected Seraphine's brother. He'd hired Seraphine herself despite the tactical risk. He'd made choices that valued something other than pure strategic advantage. He'd developed the exact kind of weaknesses they were planning to exploit. Through the wire, he heard Seraphine's voice, carefully neutral. And you think exposing these attachments will destroy him? I think it will make him desperate. Pemberton sounded confident. And desperate men make mistakes. Marrow tried to break him through force and failed because Blackthorn is strongest when he's cornered and fighting. But if we threaten the people he's started to care about, if we make him choose between his empire and his emerging conscience, he'll choose the empire, another man said doubtfully. Will he? Pemberton's voice carried dark amusement, because the intelligence we're receiving suggests otherwise. Our source inside Blackthorn's organization reports that he's been exhibiting unusual behavior. Hesitation, second-guessing, actually considering consequences beyond immediate tactical advantage. Who's the source? Seraphine asked, and her voice was so casually curious that Cedric almost missed the importance of the question. Someone close enough to observe his daily operations. Pemberton clearly wasn't going to reveal more. The point is, gentlemen, and Lady Vale, we have an opportunity. Blackthorn is changing, and change creates vulnerability. We just need to exploit it correctly. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, discussing specific tactics and timelines. Cedric listened to every word while his mind worked through implications like a machine processing data. They had a source inside his organization. Someone close enough to observe his behavior and report it to Pemberton. Someone he trusted enough to allow proximity. The list of possible suspects was short, and every name on it made him want to commit violence. Finally, the meeting concluded. Seraphine made appropriately non-committal comments about needing time to consider her involvement. Pemberton accepted this with understanding that sounded genuine and was probably calculated manipulation. She left the Ashworth estate and the surveillance team tracked her back to neutral ground where Cedric's carriage was waiting. She climbed in looking composed, despite having spent the last hour surrounded by people planning his destruction. The wire came off and she handed it to Cartwright. Well? Cedric asked. It's worse than we thought. Seraphine's voice was steady, but her hand shook slightly as she removed her gloves. They're not going after your holdings. They're going after you personally, using your recent decisions as evidence that you're compromised and building a campaign to expose you as weak. I heard. His voice was flat. What I need from you is analysis. Will it work? Seraphine looked at him directly, and for the first time he saw something like concern in her expression. Yes, she said quietly, because they're not wrong. You are changing. You protected my family when cold calculation said to sacrifice us. You hired me despite the risk. You're making choices that prioritize something other than pure strategic advantage. She paused, choosing words carefully. That makes you more human. But in the world you've built, being human is the same as being weak, and weakness is fatal. The carriage rattled through London streets while Cedric processed what she'd said. She was right. He'd spent 10 years building an empire on fear and absolute certainty. And recently, he'd started making decisions that valued other considerations. He'd started caring about consequences beyond his own survival, and now that care was being weaponized against him. There's a source inside my organization, he said finally, someone reporting to Pemberton. I know, I heard. Any thoughts on who? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then, someone who has access to your daily operations. Someone you trust enough not to hide your reactions from. Someone who's been with you long enough to notice the change in your behavior. That's not an answer, because I don't have one yet, but I can find out. Her voice carried cold certainty. Give me access to your household staff records, your security team, anyone who has regular proximity to you. I'll identify the source. And then you decide what to do with them. She met his gaze. But Cedric, understand something. Whoever this is, they're betraying you because they believe you're becoming weak. which means eliminating them won't solve the real problem. The real problem being that they're not entirely wrong. The carriage went silent except for the sound of rain hammering the roof and wheels splashing through flooded streets. Cedric looked at this woman who'd walked into a conspiracy at his instruction and come back with intelligence that proved his enemies were right to see him as vulnerable. "I should kill you," he said quietly. "You've just confirmed that I'm compromised, that I'm making emotional decisions that create tactical weakness. In my world, that information makes you too dangerous to keep alive." Seraphine didn't flinch. "You won't, though." "No?" "No. Because killing me proves them right, proves you're still the monster who destroys anything that challenges him. And part of you doesn't want to be that monster anymore." She leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. "Here's what I think, Your Grace. I think you've spent 10 years building an empire on fear, and you're only now realizing that fear isn't the same as power. Real power doesn't require constant violence to maintain itself. Real power creates systems stable enough to survive without you terrorizing everyone into submission. That's idealistic nonsense. Is it? Then explain why you protected my family, why you hired me, why you're sitting in this carriage talking to me instead of having Cartwright put a bullet in my head the moment I confirmed you're vulnerable. Because you're useful." "I'm dangerous." Seraphine's voice was sharp. "I know too much. I'm too smart to control completely, and I've just told you that your enemies are right to see you as weak. Useful doesn't outweigh that risk unless you've started valuing something other than pure survival." The carriage stopped outside Blackthorn Manor. Rain pounded the cobblestones hard enough to sound like artillery fire. Cedric looked at Seraphine Vale and realized she'd just dismantled his entire worldview in approximately 3 minutes of conversation. Everything he'd built was predicated on fear being absolute and weaknesses being fatal. But she was sitting here arguing that the very things his enemies identified as weaknesses might actually be the foundation of something stronger than what he'd built. It was insane. It was also the first thing that had made sense in years. "Get inside," he said finally. "We have work to do." They walked through the rain into Blackthorn Manor, two people who understood power in ways most never would, both aware that everything was about to change. Inside, Cedric gave Cartwright instructions to begin investigating potential sources. Then he turned to Seraphine. "You'll stay here. Guest quarters on the 3rd floor. Full access to household records and security files." "For how long?" "Until we've identified the traitor and dismantled Pemberton's conspiracy." His voice was hard. "And Seraphine? Don't mistake me allowing you proximity for trust. You're here because you're useful." "The moment that changes, so does our arrangement." "Understood." But there was something in her expression that suggested she didn't quite believe him. That night, Cedric stood alone in his study, looking out over London while rain tried to drown the city. Somewhere in his household, a traitor was feeding information to people who wanted to destroy him. Somewhere in that same household, a woman who'd documented a conspiracy and walked into danger at his instruction was probably still awake, working through files and looking for patterns. He'd spent 10 years building an empire where trust was weakness and isolation was strength. Now he was surrounded by people who'd proven that isolation created blind spots and paranoia wasn't the same as security. His enemies thought he was weak because he'd started caring about consequences. Maybe they were right. Or maybe the real weakness had been building a system where the only way to survive was to become a monster incapable of trusting anyone. The rain hammered against the windows while Cedric stood in the dark, trying to figure out which version of himself would survive what was coming. The monster who destroyed everything, or the man who'd started to wonder if there was another way. Both options terrified him equally. And somewhere in the city, Pemberton was planning the next strike, confident that he understood Cedric's weaknesses well enough to exploit them. What he didn't understand was that Cedric had spent his entire life surviving by being more ruthless than anyone expected. And nothing made him more dangerous than people who assumed they'd already won. The traitor was found on the 4th day. Cedric had been reviewing shipping manifests in his study when Seraphine appeared in the doorway, looking like someone who'd just uncovered a mass grave. Her face was pale, her hands steady despite what he could see in her eyes. She held a single file folder. "You need to see this," she said quietly. He took the folder and opened it. Inside were financial records, coded correspondence, meeting logs spanning 18 months. The handwriting was familiar enough to make his stomach turn. James Cartwright, his head of security, the man he'd trusted to coordinate surveillance on Seraphine, the person who'd been positioned to observe every decision Cedric made every vulnerability he'd shown, every moment of hesitation that marked his transformation from absolute monster to something almost human. The man who'd been feeding it all to Pemberton. Cedric read through the documentation with mechanical precision, his mind cataloging each piece of evidence while something cold and murderous built behind his sternum. Cartwright had been thorough. Monthly reports detailing Cedric's behavior patterns, strategic decisions, even conversations the man had overheard through doors that should have been thick enough to ensure privacy. He'd documented everything, sold it all to the conspiracy, and he'd done it for 18 months without Cedric suspecting a thing. "How did you find this?" Cedric's voice was flat, empty of everything except the rage he was actively suppressing. "Bank records." Seraphine moved into the study and closed the door behind her. Cartwright's been depositing significant sums into an account registered under his mother's maiden name. The transactions aligned perfectly with Pemberton's conspiracy timeline. She pulled out another document. "I also found correspondence between Cartwright and Nathaniel Thorne dating back 2 years. They served together in the military." That's where the connection started, before Marrow's conspiracy even began. "Yes." Seraphine's voice carried something like sympathy, which somehow made it worse. Cartwright was the inside man from the beginning. He helped Marrow build the first conspiracy, and when that failed, he simply continued with Pemberton's version. "You've been compromised from the start." The folder slipped from Cedric's hands and scattered papers across his desk. He stared at the evidence of betrayal so complete, so sustained, that it rewrote his entire understanding of the past 2 years. Every decision he'd made had been observed and reported. Every moment of vulnerability had been weaponized. Every strategic choice had been fed to people actively working to destroy him. And he'd never seen it. "Where is he now?" Cedric's voice could have frozen blood. "In the security office. He doesn't know we've found him yet. Keep it that way." Cedric stood slowly, every movement controlled despite the violence building inside him. "I want a team positioned outside the office. No one goes in or out without my direct authorization." "What are you going to do? Get answers." Seraphine stepped into his path before he could reach the door. Her expression was careful, like she was approaching something dangerous that might detonate at the slightest pressure. "Cedric, listen to me. Whatever you're planning, think it through first. Cartwright has been feeding information to Pemberton for 18 months. That means he knows things, procedures, security protocols, contingencies you've built in case of emergency. Your point? My point is if you go in there angry and kill him immediately, you lose the opportunity to find out what else he's told them, what other vulnerabilities they know about, what their next move is." She was right, which made the rage churning through his system even harder to contain. He wanted to walk into that office and tear Cartwright apart with his bare hands. Wanted to make the man understand exactly what happened to people who betrayed him. But Seraphine was right. Information first, violence after. "Fine," he said through clenched teeth. "We interrogate him, extract everything he knows. Then I decide what happens next. I'm coming with you." "No." Seraphine's expression hardened. "Yes. Because you're barely holding yourself together right now, and you need someone in that room who can think clearly while you're fighting the urge to commit murder." "I don't need—" "You do." Her voice cut through his protest like a blade. "You're compromised, Cedric. Emotionally compromised, which is exactly what Pemberton's been counting on. So you can either let me help you stay focused, or you can go in there alone and prove to everyone watching that they were right to see you as weak." The words hit like a physical blow because they were accurate. He was compromised. The betrayal had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of control and trust, and walking into that room alone would be letting emotion drive strategy, which was exactly the weakness they'd been exploiting. He hated that she was right, hated that he needed her clarity when his own judgment was clouded by rage and wounded pride. But he hated the idea of proving his enemies right even more. "Fine," he said. "You come. But you stay silent unless I ask for input." "Agreed." They walked through Blackthorn Manor's corridors together, each step measured and deliberate. Cedric could feel this violence coiled inside him like a spring wound too tight, ready to explode the moment he saw Cartwright's face. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to plan. Information first. Always information first. The security office was at the east end of the manor, a converted library that Cartwright had transformed into a command center for Blackthorn's protective operations. 2 guards stood outside the door, men Cedric had personally vetted years ago. He He wondered if they were compromised too. Paranoia was a knife that cut in all directions. "Is he inside?" Cedric asked. "Yes, Your Grace." One guard looked uncertain. "Is there a problem?" "Potential security breach. No one enters or leaves until I give clearance. Understood?" Both guards nodded. Cedric opened the door and walked into the office with Seraphine following close behind. Cartwright was sitting at his desk reviewing reports, and he looked up with the same professional efficiency he'd shown for years. "Your Grace." Cartwright stood immediately. "I wasn't expecting you. Sit down, James." Something in Cedric's voice must have registered because Cartwright's expression shifted from professional to wary in the space between heartbeats. He sat slowly, his eyes moving from Cedric to Seraphine and back. "Is there a problem? You tell me." Cedric pulled the folder from inside his jacket and dropped it on the desk. Seraphine found something interesting while reviewing household finances. Cartwright looked at the folder without touching it. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and Cedric knew the man had already calculated his options and realized none of them ended well. The change in posture was confession enough. "How long?" Cedric's voice was deadly quiet. 2 years. Cartwright met his gaze directly, and there was no shame in his expression, just resignation, since before Marrow's conspiracy began. "Why?" "Because you're a monster who built an empire on fear, and I got tired of serving someone who treated human life like ammunition." Cartwright's voice carried anger that must have been building for years. "You've destroyed families, ruined lives, crushed anyone who stood in your way without a second thought. Someone needed to stop you, so you became a traitor. I became someone willing to do what was necessary, same as you taught me." The parallel was deliberate and cutting, and Cedric felt it land like a blade between ribs. Cartwright was using his own philosophy against him: survival through ruthlessness, victory at any cost. He'd created this. "What did you tell Pemberton?" Seraphine's voice cut through the tension. "Everything?" "Everything that mattered." Cartwright looked at her with something like respect. Security protocols, staff loyalty assessments, the Duke's daily routines and decision-making patterns. Every weakness I could identify, including his recent behavioral changes, Cedric said, especially those. Cartwright leaned back in his chair like a man who'd already accepted his fate. "You started making decisions based on emotion instead of pure calculation, protecting people who didn't serve strategic value, showing mercy when execution would have been smarter." He gestured at Seraphine. "Hiring her was the clearest sign. You knew she was dangerous, knew she could be playing you, but you did it anyway because some part of you wanted to believe you could trust someone, that you could build something other than an empire of fear." His expression hardened. "That weakness is going to destroy you." "Maybe," Cedric said quietly. "Or maybe the weakness was building a system so dependent on fear that the only people I could trust were the ones too terrified to betray me, which left me vulnerable to anyone smart enough to hide their contempt behind professional loyalty." Cartwright actually smiled. "You're learning. Too late, but you're learning." Cedric walked around the desk slowly, each step deliberate. He could feel Seraphine watching him, could sense her tension as she calculated whether he was about to do something that would prove Pemberton right. "Tell me about the next attack," Cedric said. "Pemberton's planning something. What is it?" Cartwright was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, and the sound was bitter and dark. "You really think I'm going to tell you that? After everything, you think I'm going to hand you the information you need to survive?" "I think you're going to tell me because the alternative is me spending the next several hours making you scream until you do." Cedric's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "And we both know I'm creative enough to make that last a very long time." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. Cartwright's smile faded. "You won't, because torture is messy and unreliable, and you're too pragmatic to waste time on revenge when you could be planning your next move. Normally, you'd be right." Cedric leaned against the desk, his posture relaxed despite the violence radiating from every word. "But I'm emotionally compromised, remember? You said so yourself, which means I might make decisions based on anger instead of strategy." He let that sink in. "So here's your choice, James. You tell me what Pemberton's planning, or I discover exactly how far my recent transformation extends. Maybe I'm still enough of a monster to enjoy watching you break. Maybe I've changed enough that torture would bother me." His smile was razor-sharp and empty. Only one way to find out. The office went silent, except for the distant sound of London traffic and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Cartwright stared at Cedric like he was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Then he started talking. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Pemberton wasn't going to attack Blackthorn Holdings or attempt another financial conspiracy. Instead, he was going to expose Cedric publicly. Parliamentary testimony detailing every illegal act Cedric had committed over the past decade. Financial records showing bribes, blackmail, and coercion. Witness statements from people Cedric had destroyed, carefully curated to paint him as a tyrant who'd operated outside the law for years. They were going to drag him before Parliament and dismantle his reputation piece by piece until there was nothing left but a criminal in expensive clothes. And the evidence was comprehensive enough that even his political allies wouldn't be able to protect him. When? Cedric asked. Next week. Parliamentary session scheduled specifically for the testimony. Pemberton's already coordinated with enough members to ensure it happens regardless of procedural objections. Who's testifying? Cartwright pulled out a list from his desk drawer. 20 names. People Cedric had ruined over the years, all perfectly positioned to corroborate each other's accounts. Cedric scanned the list and felt something cold settle in his chest. These weren't random victims. They were carefully selected to represent different aspects of his operation. Financial crimes, political corruption, personal vendettas elevated to institutional destruction. Together, their testimony would be devastating. This goes public, he said quietly, and everything I've built collapses. That's the idea. Cartwright's voice carried grim satisfaction. You can't fight this with violence or intimidation. It's a legal execution, and the evidence is solid enough that running would just confirm your guilt. What about foreign involvement? Seraphine spoke for the first time since Cartwright had started talking. The German investors, the secondary conspiracy. Pemberton's insulated them. As far as Parliament will know, this is purely domestic accountability for domestic crimes. The foreign connections stay buried? She looked at Cedric. They've built a trap you can't shoot your way out of. He knew she was right. This wasn't a battle he could win through traditional means. Violence would confirm everything they were saying about him. Running would prove guilt. Even staying and fighting would just give them a platform to parade his crimes in front of everyone who mattered. They'd found the one attack vector he couldn't defend against. Public accountability for a man who'd built an empire by operating outside public scrutiny. Cedric walked to the window and looked out over the grounds of Blackthorn Manor. Behind him, he could feel Seraphine's attention and Cartwright's bitter satisfaction. He'd spent 10 years becoming exactly what the world feared, a monster who crushed opposition and built power through ruthless efficiency. And now that same ruthlessness was being weaponized against him through a system he couldn't intimidate or destroy. The empire he'd built on fear was about to collapse under the weight of its own foundation. You're finished, Cartwright said quietly. Even if you survive the testimony, even if you somehow avoid criminal charges, your reputation will be destroyed. No one will work with you. No allies will support you. You'll be a pariah operating from the margins until someone brave enough finally puts a bullet in you. Probably, Cedric agreed. Then he turned from the window and shot Cartwright twice in the chest. The gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space. Cartwright's body jerked backward and collapsed against the chair, blood spreading across his shirt in patterns that looked almost artistic in the lamplight. Seraphine didn't scream or flinch. She just stared at Cedric, like she was watching something inevitable and terrible play out exactly as predicted. The door burst open and the guards rushed in with weapons drawn. They saw Cartwright's body and immediately aimed at Cedric. Stand down, Cedric said calmly. He was a traitor selling information to conspirators planning parliamentary action against Blackthorn interests. The execution was justified. The guards looked uncertain, but lowered their weapons. They'd been trained to follow Cedric's authority without question, and old habits were powerful even in shocking circumstances. Remove the body, Cedric ordered, discreetly, and sweep this office for any additional evidence he might have hidden. Yes, Your Grace. The guards moved to comply, and Cedric walked out of the office with Seraphine following silently behind. They made it halfway down the corridor before she grabbed his arm and pulled him into an empty sitting room. What the hell was that? Her voice was low and furious. I told you we needed information first. You just murdered the one person who could have given us details about Pemberton's network. We got what we needed. The testimony is next week. The evidence is already compiled. Knowing more names wouldn't have changed the fundamental problem. So you killed him out of anger. I killed him because he was right. Cedric's voice was flat, empty. I am finished. The testimony will destroy everything I've built regardless of how I respond. Cartwright knew it. Pemberton knows it. And now you know it too. He walked to the window and stared out at nothing. The only question is what I do with the time I have left. And I decided the first thing I'd do is make sure the man who betrayed me understood there are still consequences for treachery, even when the traitor thinks they've already won. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You just proved them right. You made an emotional decision based on rage instead of strategy. That's exactly the weakness they've been documenting." "I know. So what now? You wait for the parliamentary testimony and let them tear you apart publicly?" "No." Cedric turned to face her. "I burn it all down first. If they want a monster, I'll give them one comprehensive enough that they'll remember what happens when you corner something dangerous instead of killing it cleanly. You're talking about wholesale destruction, targeting everyone involved regardless of collateral damage. I'm talking about survival." His voice was cold and certain. "Pemberton built a legal trap because he thought I'd be constrained by wanting to preserve my reputation. But if my reputation is already destroyed, why would I care about the bodies I leave behind? Because that proves everything they're saying about you." Seraphine stepped closer, her expression intense. "You want to survive this? Actually survive instead of just burning everything down on your way out? Then you need to do something they're not expecting, which is tell the truth." Cedric actually laughed, and the sound was hollow. "The truth will destroy me faster than their testimony. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only move they haven't prepared for." She pulled out the list of witnesses Cartwright had provided. "These people aren't lying about what you did to them. You ruined their lives, destroyed their families, used them and discarded them when they stopped being useful. Your point?" "My point is you can't fight their testimony with denial because it's all true, but you can fight it with context, with explanation, with the acknowledgement that you did terrible things, and the question of whether the system that made you necessary is worse than the monster it created. That's sophistical nonsense." "Is it?" Seraphine's voice was sharp. "You operated outside the law because the law protected people who were destroying others through legal means. You built an empire on fear because the alternative was being crushed by people who used legitimacy as a weapon. Everything you did was monstrous, but it was monstrous in response to a world that rewards monstrosity as long as it's dressed in proper procedure." She moved closer. "You go before Parliament and own what you are. Admit every crime, acknowledge every victim, and then ask them why the system they're defending created the exact conditions that made someone like you inevitable. They'll crucify me anyway. Probably. But at least you'll have told a truth they can't refute. And maybe, just maybe, some people will hear it and start asking the right questions about power and accountability, and whether destroying one monster changes anything if the conditions that created him remain intact." Cedric stared at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. The idea was insane, suicidal. It went against every instinct he'd honed over 10 years of survival through ruthless pragmatism. It was also the only option he hadn't considered, because every other option assumed he was still trying to win the same game he'd been playing: preserve power, maintain control, survive through dominance. But that game was already over. Pemberton had changed the rules, and the only way to survive the new game was to stop playing by the old assumptions. "They'll destroy me anyway," he said quietly. "Yes." Seraphine's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "But they're going to do that regardless. The only question is whether you go down as the monster they're painting you as, or as someone willing to tell the truth about what the world demanded you become. And you think the truth matters? I think it's the only thing you have left." The sitting room was silent except for London traffic and the distant sound of servants moving through the manor. Cedric felt the weight of 10 years crashing down around him. Every decision, every victim, every choice that had seemed necessary at the time. He'd built an empire on fear because the alternative was being destroyed by people who used legitimacy to commit atrocities. He'd become a monster because the world rewarded monstrosity. And now that monstrosity was being used to justify his destruction, and he had no defense except the truth that would condemn him even as it explained him. "I need time," he said finally. "Time to think. Time to decide whether I'm willing to stand before Parliament and admit to everything knowing it will end with my execution or exile. You have 6 days." Seraphine's voice was steady. "Use them wisely." She left him alone in the sitting room, and Cedric stood there feeling the walls closing in. "Just The next 3 days were hell. Cedric spent them reviewing every crime he'd committed, every life he'd destroyed, every choice that had seemed necessary in the moment but looked monstrous in retrospect. He compiled his own testimony, documenting everything Pemberton's witnesses would say and adding details they wouldn't know. The financial coercion, the political manipulation, the personal vendettas elevated to institutional destruction. All of it true. All of it damning. All of it explained by a system that rewarded the behavior it pretended to condemn. Seraphine worked alongside him, organizing documentation and challenging his rationalizations whenever he tried to soften the language or deflect responsibility. You can't say you were forced into these choices, she told him, after he tried to frame one particular incident as defensive necessity. You chose to destroy that family because it was convenient, and you wanted to make an example. Own it. Owning it meant acknowledging he'd become exactly what he'd feared as a younger man. A monster who treated people as tools and discarded them when their utility expired. It meant admitting Cartwright had been right. On the fourth day, everything changed. Cedric was in his study reviewing testimony drafts when Seraphine burst through the door, holding papers that shook in her hands. "We have a problem." "What now?" "Adrian, my brother." She looked terrified. Pemberton took him. Cedric went very still. "Explain." "He was in our family estate outside London. Pemberton's men grabbed him this morning. Left a message saying, if you don't withdraw from public life immediately and transfer controlling interest in all Northern holdings to a trust managed by Pemberton's associates, they'll execute Adrian and frame you for his murder." The strategic brilliance was impressive even as it was infuriating. They'd identified the one attachment Cedric had actually developed, the one decision he'd made based on something other than pure calculation. He'd protected the Vale family, specifically Adrian, who'd been tangentially involved in Marrow's conspiracy. And now that protection was being weaponized. "When?" Cedric's voice was mechanical. "You have 48 hours to comply or they kill him." "And if I do comply? Then you lose everything anyway, and they probably kill him afterward to eliminate witnesses. So we're looking at Adrian's execution regardless of my choice. The only question is whether I let them use his death to extract concessions first." Seraphine's face went pale. "You're talking about my brother. I'm talking about tactical realities." Cedric stood and walked to the window, his mind already calculating options. "Pemberton took Adrian because he knew I'd protected him once. He's betting I'll do it again even when the smart move is to let him die and refuse the demands. You protected us before." "I did. And that decision is now being used to destroy everything I've built, which proves Cartwright was right. Attachments are weaknesses that get exploited." The room went silent except for Seraphine's breathing, which had gone rapid and shallow. "So you're going to let them kill him," she said quietly. "You're going to stand there and calculate that my brother's life isn't worth the strategic cost, and you're going to let them execute him. I'm considering all options. He's 23 years old." Seraphine's voice cracked. "He made one stupid mistake getting involved with Marrow's people, and you're going to let him die for it because saving him might compromise your position." Cedric turned from the window to face her. "Do you want me to lie? Pretend I haven't spent the last 4 days documenting every monstrous choice I've made? I destroyed families for less reason than Pemberton has for killing your brother. I'm the last person who should be lecturing anyone about the value of human life. But you changed." Her eyes were desperate. "You started making different choices. You protected us when calculation said to sacrifice us. You hired me when it was tactically stupid. You've been becoming someone different." "And look where that got us." Cedric's voice was harsh. "Cartwright betrayed me because I got soft. Pemberton is targeting your brother because I showed weakness by protecting him. Every choice I made that valued something other than pure survival has been weaponized against me." He moved closer. "So maybe the real lesson is I should have stayed the monster. Maybe Cartwright was right, and changing was the mistake that's going to destroy everything. You don't believe that, don't I? Because right now, the only choice that makes strategic sense is letting your brother die and refusing Pemberton's demands. Anything else proves I'm compromised and gives them exactly the leverage they're looking for." The air in the study felt thick enough to choke on. Seraphine stared at him like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, and what she saw was exactly the monster everyone had always claimed he was. Then she did something he didn't expect. She walked to his desk, picked up the loaded pistol he kept in the top drawer, and pointed it at him. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "You're going to save my brother. Or what?" You'll shoot me? Cedric didn't move. Go ahead, Seraphine. Prove that when it matters, when the choice is between principle and survival, everyone makes the same calculation. You'll kill me because your brother's life matters more than whatever truth we were building together. I'll do it. I know. That's what makes this moment so perfectly representative. He took a step toward her. You came to me offering intelligence and pragmatism. You argued that I should tell the truth before Parliament even though it would destroy me. You've been positioning yourself as someone who understands power without sentiment. Another step. But now that it's your family, now that the cost is personal, all that pragmatism disappears. You're willing to kill me to save one person who matters to you, which makes you exactly like everyone else. Exactly like me. Stop. Why? We're finally being honest. Cedric's voice was cold. You want me to save Adrian because he's your brother. Not because it's strategically sound or morally righteous, but because you love him and you can't stomach the idea of letting him die, even when saving him might cost everything. He was close enough now to touch the gun. That's not weakness, Seraphine. That's being human. And the tragedy is I've spent 10 years trying to eliminate exactly that quality from my decision-making, and now I'm being destroyed because I started letting it back in. Then save him, she whispered. If you understand that, if you recognize what it means to value someone beyond their utility, save him. Cedric looked at her face, saw the tears tracking down her cheeks, saw the desperation and fear and love that made her willing to threaten him with a gun, despite knowing exactly how dangerous he was. And he made his choice, the choice that would destroy him, the choice that proved Cartwright right, the choice that meant he'd become someone fundamentally different from the monster who'd built an empire on fear. Lower the gun, he said quietly. Promise me. I can't promise Adrian survives, but I can promise I'll try to save him even though it's tactically stupid and strategically suicidal. She lowered the weapon slowly. Why? Because you're right. I did change. And maybe that change is what's destroying me, but going back to being the monster won't save anything either. It'll just prove that the world is exactly as hopeless as it appears. He took the gun from her shaking hands and set it on the desk. We have 48 hours. Let's figure out how to do something impossible. What? The plan they built over the next 30 hours was equal parts desperate and brilliant. Pemberton's men were holding Adrian in a warehouse near the docks, a location chosen specifically because it was isolated enough to ensure no witnesses. The building was guarded, exits were covered, and the entire operation was designed to make rescue impossible, which meant a direct assault would fail. So they built something else. Cedric reached out to contacts he'd maintained in London's criminal underground. People who owed him favors, people who understood that sometimes the enemy of their enemy was worth temporary alliance. He offered them information about Pemberton's operation, details about the conspiracy's financial structure and foreign connections. In exchange, they provided bodies, enough armed men to create chaos and cover. Meanwhile, Seraphine contacted Adrian's friends, young aristocrats who'd known him at university. She convinced 3 of them to pose as Pemberton's agents, using forged documents Cedric had his remaining loyal staff create. The deception was thin, but it didn't need to last long. Just long enough. They moved on the warehouse at dawn, when guards would be tired and less alert. Cedric's criminal allies created disturbances at 3 other dock locations simultaneously, pulling police and private security away from the target area. Then the false agents approached the warehouse carrying documents that supposedly authorized Adrian's transfer to a secondary location. The guards checked the paperwork, found it convincing enough, started the process of moving Adrian to the waiting carriage. That's when Cedric struck. He came through the warehouse's side entrance with 4 armed men, moving fast and low. The guards turned too late, confused by the simultaneous arrival of authorized transfer agents and armed assault. The firefight was brief and brutal. 2 guards went down in the first seconds. A third tried to run and took a bullet in the leg. The last one managed to get a shot off that grazed Cedric's shoulder before being neutralized. Through it all, Cedric moved with the same cold efficiency that had built his empire. No hesitation, no mercy. Just pure mechanical violence aimed at a specific objective. He reached Adrian before the young man could fully process what was happening, grabbed him, pulled him toward the exit while Seraphine's aristocratic friends provided covering fire with weapons they clearly barely knew how to use. They made it to the carriage, made it through the docks, made it back to neutral ground before Pemberton's people could coordinate a response. Adrian was safe, and Cedric had just committed a dozen additional crimes that would be added to his parliamentary testimony. Back at Blackthorn Manor, Seraphine threw her arms around her brother while he stood there looking shell-shocked and traumatized. Cedric watched them from across the room, his shoulder bleeding through makeshift bandages, his mind already calculating the cost of what he'd just done. He'd saved one life and guaranteed his own destruction, because now Pemberton had attempted kidnapping and assault to add to the list of grievances, had evidence of Cedric coordinating with criminal elements, had proof of the violence everyone had always claimed to find him. The parliamentary testimony was 2 days away, and he just handed them ammunition that would ensure his conviction. Seraphine looked up from embracing her brother and met Cedric's gaze across the room. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. We're not finished." Adrian pulled away from his sister and looked at Cedric with something like awe and terror mixed together. "You saved me. Why?" "Because apparently I've become someone stupid enough to value human life over strategic advantage." Cedric's voice was dry. "Your sister convinced me it was worth trying." "I'll testify," Adrian said suddenly. "At Parliament. I'll tell them what Pemberton did, how he took me, how you risked everything to—" "No." Cedric cut him off. "You'll stay silent, because anything you say will just be dismissed as loyalty bought through rescue. The only testimony that matters is mine." He looked at Seraphine. "Get your brother out of London, tonight. Somewhere Pemberton can't reach him again. This isn't over, and the next 48 hours are going to be ugly." "Where are you going?" "To finish writing my confession. The parliamentary session is in 2 days, and I need to be ready to tell the truth about everything I've done, including this morning's rescue operation." "That will destroy you," Seraphine said. "I know. But it's the only move I have left that doesn't prove I learned nothing from becoming human." He walked toward the door, then paused. "Thank you for pulling the gun on me." It clarified something I'd been avoiding, which is that I'd rather be destroyed for trying to be better than preserved for staying a monster, even if the trying is what gets me killed. He left them there and returned to his study where the half-written testimony waited. 2 days until he stood before Parliament and admitted to every crime they'd accuse him of. 2 days until he dismantled his own empire with nothing but truth and the faint hope that honesty might matter more than survival. 2 days until he discovered whether changing had been the most important thing he'd ever done or the final mistake that would end him. Outside, London woke to another day of commerce and corruption dressed as civilization. Inside Blackthorn Manor, a duke who'd built an empire on fear prepared to burn it all down for the sake of one impossible idea: that being human was worth more than being powerful, even when being human was exactly what destroyed you. The parliamentary chamber filled with bodies and whispered judgments 2 hours before the session was scheduled to begin. Cedric watched from a side gallery as aristocrats who'd spent years bowing to his power now gathered like vultures circling something dying. They wanted blood, wanted spectacle, wanted to witness the monster dragged into daylight and torn apart by the very systems he'd spent a decade circumventing. He'd given them exactly that opportunity. The testimony he'd written sat in a leather folder under his arm, 47 pages documenting every crime, every victim, every choice that had seemed necessary at the time but looked like calculated cruelty in retrospect. No softening, no excuses, just brutal honesty delivered in language precise enough to serve as his own indictment. Seraphine stood beside him wearing dark colors that made her look like she was attending a funeral, which, in a sense, she was. The death of Duke Cedric Blackthorn's empire was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and everyone in London who mattered had secured seats to watch it happen. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "We could run, disappear into Europe. You have resources hidden well enough that even Pemberton couldn't find them all, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder?" Cedric's voice was calm despite the adrenaline starting to flood his system. "Running proves guilt without offering explanation. At least this way someone hears the truth before I'm destroyed. The truth won't save you." "I know, but maybe it'll mean something to someone. Maybe one person in that chamber will hear what I'm saying about systems that create monsters and start asking the right questions." He looked at her directly. "Or maybe I just need to believe my destruction means something other than the inevitable consequence of being exactly what the world demanded I become." Seraphine's expression was unreadable. "You're a better man than you were. I'm a monster with a conscience, which might actually be worse. At least the pure monster doesn't feel regret. Before she could respond, a parliamentary aide appeared in the gallery doorway. "Your Grace, they're ready for you." Cedric took a breath that tasted like copper and resignation. Then he walked toward the chamber that would serve as either his execution or his one chance to tell a truth powerful enough to matter. The main floor was arranged like a theater built for public shaming. Witnesses sat in rows to his left, 20 people whose lives he'd destroyed staring at him with expressions ranging from hatred to grim satisfaction. The parliamentary members occupied elevated seats forming a semicircle around the central floor where Cedric would stand. And in the gallery above, hundreds of observers packed together to watch nobility eat itself. Pemberton sat among the parliamentary members, wearing an expression of such smug certainty that Cedric felt violence spike through his control. The man looked like he'd already won, like this was just formality before the inevitable conviction. He wasn't entirely wrong. Lord Pemberton called the session to order with a voice that carried false gravity. "We are gathered to hear testimony regarding serious allegations against Duke Cedric Blackthorne. Allegations of financial crimes, political corruption, intimidation, and violence spanning a decade of operations throughout England's northern territories." He paused for effect. "The Crown has granted immunity to witnesses willing to testify about the Duke's activities. We will hear from these witnesses first, then allow the accused to respond." Cedric stood in the center of the floor and said nothing. Just waited while the machinery of institutional destruction ground into motion. The first witness was a rail company owner Cedric had bankrupted 6 years ago. The man described in excruciating detail how Blackthorne had used political pressure and manufactured scandals to force a sale at below market value, then immediately resold the assets for massive profit. All true, every word. The second witness was a woman whose husband had died in one of Cedric's mining operations. She spoke about unsafe conditions, ignored safety complaints, and a system designed to maximize profit regardless of worker casualties. Also true. Cedric remembered signing off on those operational decisions without a second thought. The third witness was a former parliamentary ally who described the intricate web of bribes, blackmail, and coercion Cedric had used to pass legislation favorable to Blackthorne interests. True again. One after another, they came forward, each testimony more damning than the last. Each story a piece of the empire Cedric had built on other people's suffering. The chamber listened with rapt attention, and Cedric could feel the collective judgment solidifying around him like concrete. He was guilty. Everyone knew it. The only question was what his response would be. After the 20th witness finished, Pemberton turned to face him directly. "Your Grace, you've heard extensive testimony documenting a pattern of criminal behavior. Do you dispute these allegations?" The chamber went silent. Every eye focused on Cedric standing alone in the center of the floor. This was the moment. The choice that would define whether his destruction meant anything or was just another powerful man falling because he'd finally pushed too far. Cedric opened the leather folder and pulled out his written testimony. "No," he said clearly, "I don't dispute them. Everything you've heard is accurate. I ruined those lives, destroyed those families, used violence, coercion, and political corruption to build an empire that made me one of the wealthiest and most feared men in England." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. "But," Cedric continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "before you pass judgment, I want to explain exactly why someone like me was not only possible, but inevitable in the system you're pretending to defend." "That's not," Pemberton started. "You granted me the right to respond," Cedric interrupted. "So sit down and listen, Edward, because what I'm about to say is going to make everyone in this chamber very uncomfortable." Pemberton looked like he wanted to object, but the procedural rules he'd insisted on gave Cedric floor time. He sat slowly, his expression tight with controlled anger. Cedric looked out at the sea of faces staring at him with hatred and fascination mixed together. Then he started talking, and what came out was 10 years of suppressed truth delivered without mercy or self-pity. "I was 26 when I inherited a title that meant nothing, and debts that would have destroyed me within months. My father drank himself to death. My brother died in a duel over someone else's wife, and I was left with a choice. Disappear into poverty and irrelevance, or find a way to survive in a world that rewards ruthlessness disguised as legitimate business practice." He paced slowly, his words measured and deliberate. "Every witness who testified today told the truth about what I did to them. But let me tell you what they conveniently forgot to mention. That rail company owner? He'd been bribing safety inspectors for years, running equipment that killed workers regularly. I destroyed him because he was competition, but the methods he used were identical to mine. The only difference was I was better at it. The mining operation? Yes, conditions were dangerous. Yes, workers died. And yes, I prioritized profit over safety. Just like every other mine owner in England, the only reason I'm standing here and they're sitting in judgment is because I was more successful at extracting wealth from human suffering than they were. He could see rage building in the faces watching him, but he didn't stop. The political corruption, the bribes, the blackmail, all true. All standard practice among the people in this very chamber. The difference is, I didn't bother hiding it behind charitable foundations and carefully structured legal arrangements. I was the monster everyone pretended not to be. You're admitting to crimes, one of the parliamentary members shouted. Do you expect that honesty to absolve you? No, Cedric said flatly. I expect it to force you to confront the question you're all avoiding, which is why the system you're defending creates people like me and then acts shocked when we do exactly what that system rewards. He held up his testimony. I built my empire using techniques I learned from watching legitimate businesses destroy communities through legal means, leveraged buyouts that gutted companies and threw thousands out of work, political lobbying that passed legislation benefiting the wealthy at everyone else's expense, financial instruments designed specifically to extract wealth from people who had no way to fight back. All of it legal, all of it celebrated, all of it presented as the natural functioning of a market economy. His voice got harder. The only difference between me and the aristocrat sitting in this chamber is I stopped pretending the violence was civilized. I stopped dressing exploitation in the language of economic necessity. I looked at the world as it actually functions and decided if I was going to be a monster, I'd at least be an honest one. That's sophistry, Pemberton snapped. You're trying to justify criminal behavior by claiming everyone else does it. I'm not justifying anything. Cedric's eyes locked onto Pemberton. I'm guilty of every crime these witnesses described. I deserve whatever punishment you decide to impose. But before you congratulate yourselves on destroying one monster, ask yourself what creates the conditions that make monsters necessary. He gestured at the witnesses. Every person who testified today was victimized by me. That's true. But they were already being victimized by a system that concentrates power in the hands of people who use legal frameworks to commit the same atrocities I committed through illegal means. I'm not better than you, I'm just more honest about what we all are. The chamber exploded into argument. Parliamentary members shouted objections. Witnesses demanded he stop deflecting. Observers in the gallery erupted into chaos. Through it all, Cedric stood motionless, waiting for the noise to subside. When it finally did, Pemberton was standing with an expression of pure fury on his face. You've admitted to crimes, he said coldly. That's sufficient for conviction. The question of systemic issues is irrelevant to your individual guilt. Is it? Cedric smiled without humor. Because I notice you didn't address the substance of what I said. Didn't deny that legitimate business practices cause the same harm as my criminal enterprises. Didn't explain why destroying me changes anything about the structural conditions that made someone like me inevitable. You're a murderer and a thief trying to philosophize your way out of accountability. I'm a murderer and a thief telling you that accountability without systemic change is just theater. Execute me if you want. Exile me. Strip my titles and seize my holdings. But 10 years from now, someone else will do exactly what I did because the conditions that created me will still exist. He looked around the chamber. The only question is whether that person will be honest enough to admit what they are, or whether they'll hide behind legitimacy while committing the same atrocities I committed openly. Silence fell over the chamber like a physical weight. Cedric could see calculations happening behind dozens of eyes. People realizing that condemning him meant potentially examining their own methods. That his honesty was a weapon aimed at the entire system. Pemberton broke the silence with a voice sharp as broken glass. This testimony changes nothing. You've confessed to crimes. The punishment is clear. Agreed, Cedric said. I'm guilty. Punish me. But at least have the honesty to admit you're not destroying a monster. You're just destroying the one monster who stopped pretending to be civilized. Before Pemberton could respond, the chamber doors burst open and armed men poured in wearing military uniforms. But these weren't crown forces or parliamentary guards. These were private soldiers, and Cedric recognized their colors immediately. Nathaniel Thorne's mercenary company, the one Pemberton had been coordinating with from the beginning. Chaos erupted as witnesses scrambled for exits that were already being blocked. Parliamentary members shouted for order that wasn't coming. Observers in the gallery screamed as soldiers took positions throughout the chamber. And Pemberton stood in the center of it all, with an expression that had shifted from angry to coldly satisfied. "Your Grace," he called out over the noise, "did you really think I'd let you turn this hearing into a philosophical debate? Did you think I'd allow you to plant questions about systemic corruption that might spread beyond this chamber?" Cedric felt adrenaline spike as he realized what was happening. This wasn't a trial. It was an execution, and Pemberton had just dropped any pretense of legitimacy. "What are you doing, Edward?" One of the other parliamentary members looked terrified. "Cleaning up a mess that should have been handled years ago." Pemberton gestured to his soldiers. "The Duke of Blackthorn just confessed to a decade of crimes in front of witnesses. He's dangerous, he's unstable, and he's attempting to escape custody." "I haven't moved," Cedric said coldly. "You will, because you're about to realize that attacking parliamentary guards and fleeing the chamber makes you a fugitive who can be killed resisting arrest." Pemberton smiled. "And once you're dead, all these uncomfortable questions about systemic corruption die with you, along with anyone who might have taken your testimony seriously. He's going to kill everyone." Seraphine's voice cut through the chaos. She'd moved to the gallery railing, her face pale, but her voice steady. "Everyone who heard Cedric tell the truth. He can't let that information spread." Pemberton shrugged. "Collateral damage is unfortunate but necessary. The official report will say Blackthorn's supporters attempted a rescue that turned violent. Tragic loss of life, but order was restored." "You're insane," someone shouted. "I'm pragmatic." Pemberton's voice carried absolute certainty. Blackthorn was right about one thing. The system creates monsters. I'm just better than he was at hiding it behind procedure. He turned to his soldiers. "Kill him. Kill anyone who tries to interfere. Make it bloody enough that the message is clear." The soldiers raised their weapons. And Cedric realized he had exactly one chance to survive this and possibly save the people trapped in the chamber with him. He looked up at Seraphine in the gallery. Her eyes met his across the chaos, and he saw understanding flash between them. She knew what he was about to do, knew it was probably suicide, knew he was going to do it anyway. "Get down!" he shouted. "Everyone get down!" Then he moved. Years of survival instinct took over as Cedric dove toward the nearest soldier. His shoulder, still healing from the warehouse fight, screamed in protest, but he ignored it, grabbed the man's rifle, twisted it free, used it as a club to drop 2 more soldiers before they could react. Gunfire erupted through the chamber. Witnesses who'd come to see Cedric destroyed were now scrambling for cover as bullets tore through wooden benches and marble columns. Parliamentary members dove behind their elevated seats. Observers in the gallery pressed themselves flat against the floor. And Cedric fought like someone who had nothing left to lose because he didn't. The Empire was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His confession had been recorded. The only thing left was keeping Pemberton from murdering everyone who'd heard the truth. He took a bullet in the leg and kept moving. Dropped 3 more soldiers with shots that were more instinct than aim. Grabbed one of the fallen rifles and threw it to a parliamentary guard who'd been frozen in shock. "Shoot back," Cedric roared, "or they kill everyone." The guard's training kicked in and he started firing at Pemberton's mercenaries. 2 more guards joined him. Then civilians grabbed weapons from fallen soldiers, and the chamber transformed into a battlefield. Through the smoke and chaos, Cedric saw Pemberton retreating toward a side exit. The man had orchestrated this massacre, but wasn't brave enough to stay and watch it play out. "Coward," Cedric thought, and started after him. He made it 3 steps before another bullet caught him in the side. The impact spun him around and dropped him to his knees. Blood spread across his shirt in patterns that suggested the wound was serious, potentially fatal if he didn't get help soon. He forced himself to stand anyway, because Pemberton was getting away. And if that happened, the official story would be whatever Pemberton wanted it to be. Blackthorn's confession would be buried. The questions about systemic corruption would be dismissed as the ravings of a dying criminal. Everything he'd tried to accomplish would be erased. Cedric staggered toward the exit, leaving a blood trail behind him. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, but he could still see Pemberton's retreating form ahead, could still move fast enough to catch him. Maybe. The corridor outside the chamber was chaos, people fleeing in every direction, soldiers trying to establish perimeter control, screams and gunfire echoing off stone walls. Cedric pushed through it all, tracking Pemberton like a wounded predator following prey. He caught up to him in a side gallery overlooking the Thames. Pemberton was coordinating with his soldiers through a communication device, ordering them to seal all exits and ensure no witnesses escaped. The man turned when he heard footsteps, and his expression shifted from confident to terrified when he saw Cedric standing there bleeding but alive. "You should be dead," Pemberton said. "Probably." Cedric's voice was rough with pain and exhaustion, "but I've gotten very good at not dying when people expect me to." He took a step forward. "Call off your soldiers. Let the witnesses leave. End this before more people die. Or what? You'll kill me?" Pemberton laughed nervously. "You're barely standing. One more bullet and you're finished." "True, but I don't need long. Just enough time to make sure you don't walk out of here thinking you won." Pemberton reached for a weapon, but Cedric moved faster despite the wound slowing him down. Grabbed the man's arm, twisted it until something cracked and Pemberton screamed. Then Cedric dragged him to the gallery railing overlooking the river. "You wanted to destroy me," Cedric said quietly. "Wanted to prove I was weak because I'd started caring about consequences. You were right about the weakness. But you forgot that wounded animals are the most dangerous." He pulled Pemberton closer to the edge. "Now you're going to order your soldiers to stand down. You're going to let everyone in that chamber leave alive. And then you're going to turn yourself over to Crown authorities and confess to orchestrating this massacre. You're insane." Pemberton's voice was strangled with pain and fear. "Even if I do that, you're still destroyed. Your empire is gone. Your reputation is finished." "I know." Cedric's smile was terrible to witness. "But at least the truth got told. At least people heard what I said about systems that create monsters. That matters more than whether I survive. Nothing matters if you're dead." "Then I guess we're about to find out." Cedric's grip on Pemberton tightened as blood loss made his vision swim. Behind him, he could hear soldiers approaching, could hear Seraphine's voice shouting his name through the chaos, could feel his body shutting down from wounds that were definitely fatal without immediate medical intervention. But none of that mattered as much as making sure Pemberton didn't win, making sure the massacre didn't get buried under official lies, making sure his confession and the questions it raised survived even if he didn't. The gallery door burst open, and Nathaniel Thorne entered with armed soldiers. The man saw Cedric holding Pemberton at the railing, and his expression went cold. "Release him," Nathaniel ordered. "You're surrounded. There's no escape. I'm not looking for escape." Cedric's voice was getting weaker. "Just accountability. Your partner here orchestrated a massacre to cover up systemic corruption. People need to know that. People need to know you're a criminal who died resisting arrest." Nathaniel raised his weapon, and Cedric knew he was out of time, out of options, out of everything except the choice of how to die. He could release Pemberton and try to surrender, hope that someone survived to tell the truth about what happened here. Or he could make one final move that ensured Pemberton didn't walk away clean. The decision took less than a second. Cedric looked at Pemberton's terrified face and said quietly, "You wanted to know what real power looks like? It's being willing to lose everything to ensure the truth survives." Then he pushed Pemberton over the railing and dove after him. The fall toward the Thames seemed to take forever and no time at all. Cedric heard Seraphine screaming his name, heard gunfire as Nathaniel's soldiers fired at his falling form, felt the impact as bullets that missed Pemberton found him instead. Then the river swallowed them both in water cold enough to stop his heart. Cedric's last conscious thought was that he'd made sure Pemberton went down with him, made sure there were witnesses to the man's involvement, made sure the questions he'd raised wouldn't be easily buried, made sure his destruction meant something. Then the darkness took him, and he stopped thinking at all. Seraphine watched from the gallery as Cedric and Pemberton hit the water and disappeared beneath the surface. She was screaming but couldn't hear herself over the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The soldiers moved to the railing, scanning the river for signs of survivors. But the Thames was dark and fast-moving, and neither man surfaced. Someone grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the gallery railing. Parliamentary guards were evacuating survivors, getting them out of the building before Nathaniel's mercenaries could reorganize. She fought against them, trying to get back to the railing, trying to see if Cedric would surface. He has to surface. He has to. But the river kept flowing, and neither man appeared. The evacuation became a flood as witnesses and officials fled into London streets. Seraphine was swept along with them, her mind refusing to process what she'd just witnessed. Cedric had confessed to everything, had told the truth about systemic corruption, had forced Parliament to confront questions they'd rather ignore. And then he'd sacrificed himself to ensure Pemberton didn't escape accountability for the massacre. It was the most human thing she'd ever seen, the most hopeless and beautiful and devastating choice. And now he was gone, vanished into the Thames along with the man who'd tried to destroy him. Around her, London erupted into chaos as news of the parliamentary massacre spread. Crown forces mobilized, newspaper reporters scrambled to cover the story, and somewhere in the confusion, the truth about what Cedric had said began to spread despite Nathaniel's best efforts to contain it. People had heard the confession, had witnessed the massacre, had seen a duke sacrifice himself rather than let corruption win quietly. The questions Cedric raised wouldn't die with him, but he was still gone, still lost somewhere in the river while the city burned with the revelation of what had happened in that chamber. Seraphine stood in the street surrounded by chaos and felt her world collapse into a single desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, the man who'd survived a decade of violence through pure ruthless will had survived one more impossible situation, that the monster who'd learned to be human hadn't drowned becoming it. Behind her, Westminster Hall burned as someone set fires to destroy evidence, and the Thames kept flowing, dark and cold and silent about whether it had claimed Duke Cedric Blackthorn's life along with his empire. The Thames was cold enough to kill within minutes, and Cedric discovered that drowning was slower than anyone ever told you it would be. He'd hit the water with enough force to drive what little air remained in his lungs straight out through his teeth. The current grabbed him immediately, pulled him under, spun him in darkness that felt absolute and final. His wounds screamed protest that his nervous system barely registered anymore. Everything was cold in pressure and the certain knowledge that this was how it ended. Not in glory, not in victory, just drowning in a river that had swallowed countless bodies before his and would swallow countless more after. He tried to swim, but his arms wouldn't cooperate. The bullet wounds had stolen too much blood, too much strength. His leg barely functioned, and the current was stronger than anything human will could overcome. So this was death. This cold, drowning darkness while London continued burning above. Not the worst way to go, all things considered. At least he'd made sure Pemberton went down with him. At least the truth had been spoken before the water took him. Small victories when you measured them against the enormity of failure, but victories nonetheless. His consciousness started to fragment. Images from the past decade flashing through his mind in no particular order. Building the empire. Destroying families. Making choices that seemed necessary and felt monstrous. Becoming exactly what survival demanded and hating every moment of clarity that showed him what he'd turned into. Then newer memories. Seraphine walking into his study and refusing to be afraid. Adrian's terrified face in the warehouse. The parliamentary chamber erupting into chaos. The look in Pemberton's eyes when he realized Cedric was dragging him over the railing. The water pressed in from all sides and Cedric felt his body starting to shut down. This was it. The final moments. The last seconds of Duke Cedric Blackthorn drowning like any other man despite spending 10 years pretending he was something more. Something grabbed his collar and yanked him upward with force that felt almost violent. His head broke the surface and he gasped air that tasted like smoke and sewage. And the most beautiful thing he'd ever experienced. Someone was pulling him through the water toward the riverbank. Strong hands, determined movements. A voice he didn't recognize shouting instructions to people on shore. He tried to speak but couldn't manage anything beyond coughing water from his lungs. The hands dragged him onto stone steps leading up from the river. More people grabbed him, pulled him fully onto the embankment, and through vision that was still blurred from near drowning, Cedric saw faces he recognized. The criminal elements he'd contacted for the warehouse rescue. Street people who operated in London's shadows. A few dock workers who'd taken Blackthorn money over the years, and apparently decided that debt meant something. The people society ignored had just saved his life. "He's bleeding bad," someone said. "Needs a surgeon." "No hospitals," another voice countered. "Crown forces will be looking for him. Take him to the safe house on Mercer Street." Cedric tried to object, but his body had other priorities. Consciousness slipped away again, as they lifted him and carried him through streets that felt like they were tilting sideways. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the burning silhouette of Westminster Hall against the night sky. The empire was gone. The confession was spoken, and somehow, impossibly, he was still alive, for now. He woke 3 days later in a room that smelled like antiseptic and old blood. The ceiling above him was cracked plaster with water stains that suggested this building had seen better decades. Pain radiated from his shoulder, his side, his leg, everywhere bullets had found him during the parliamentary massacre. But he was alive. Breathing hurt. Moving was impossible. But he was definitely, inexplicably alive. "You're awake." Seraphine's voice came from somewhere to his left. "Thank God. The surgeon said if you didn't wake soon, we'd lose you to infection." Cedric turned his head slowly and found her sitting in a chair that looked like it had been salvaged from somewhere nicer before hard times struck. Her face was pale, exhausted, marked by stress that had carved new lines around her eyes. She looked beautiful in the way broken things sometimes do when they're still fighting. "How long?" His voice was rough enough to hurt his own ears. 3 days since the massacre. You've been unconscious the entire time. We had to move you twice when Crown forces got too close to our location." "Pemberton?" "Dead. They pulled his body from the river 6 hours after you went in. Nathaniel Thorne tried to spin it as Blackthorne murdering a parliamentary member, but too many witnesses saw what actually happened." Cedric processed that information slowly. Pemberton was dead. The man who'd orchestrated the conspiracy, who'd tried to bury the truth under a massacre, had drowned in the Thames. One problem solved, approximately 1,000 more remaining. "What happened after?" he asked. "At Parliament. The witnesses." Seraphine leaned forward, and he could see exhaustion in every line of her body. "It's complicated. Nathaniel's mercenaries killed 17 people before Crown forces arrived and shut it down, but not before your confession spread. People heard what you said about systemic corruption, about monsters being created by the very systems that pretend to condemn them." She pulled out a newspaper and held it where he could see the headline. "Duke confesses to decade of crimes, questions parliamentary corruption before massacre." The article was brutal. It documented every admission Cedric had made, every crime he'd confessed to, every witness who'd testified to his destruction of their lives. But it also included substantial portions of his response, his argument about systems creating monsters, his challenge to the chamber about examining the structural conditions that made someone like him inevitable. The truth had survived, damaged and incomplete, but it had survived. "They're calling for your arrest," Seraphine continued. "Crown wants you tried for the murders during the massacre. Parliament wants you executed for the confession alone. And half of London's aristocracy wants you dead because you've made everyone start asking uncomfortable questions about how legitimate business practices differ from your criminal enterprises. So nothing's changed except now I'm a fugitive instead of a duke. Everything's changed." Her voice carried intensity that made him focus despite the pain. "People are talking about wealth inequality, about legal frameworks that enable exploitation, about the difference between legitimate power and criminal violence being mostly a matter of paperwork." She set down the newspaper. "You confessed to being a monster and forced everyone to confront the question of what creates monsters. That's not nothing, Cedric. That's the beginning of something that might actually matter. Or it's just noise that gets forgotten the moment they find me and execute me for crimes I absolutely committed." "Maybe." Seraphine's expression was unreadable. "But at least you told the truth before the end. At least you chose to be human instead of staying the monster. And look where that got us." Cedric gestured weakly at the decrepit room, his broken body, the newspaper documenting his comprehensive destruction. Empire gone. Reputation destroyed. Hiding in safe houses while Crown forces hunt me. Being human was a terrible strategic decision. Was it? Because the monster would have let Adrian die. Would have killed me when I pulled the gun on you. Would have run instead of confessing. And that monster would still be alone in Blackthorn Manor, wondering why absolute power felt like absolute isolation. She had a point, which was annoying because accepting it meant acknowledging that everything he'd lost had been worth losing for reasons he still barely understood. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you heal." Seraphine stood and walked to the window. "Your criminal contacts have offered to smuggle you out of England. Ships leaving for America, for the continent, for anywhere you want to disappear. And if I don't want to disappear, then you die." Her voice was flat. "Crown forces will find you eventually. When they do, there won't be a trial. Just execution for crimes against Parliament and murder of witnesses. So my choices are run or die." "Yes." The room fell silent, except for London street sounds filtering through the window. Cedric lay there feeling the weight of consequences pressing down like physical force. He'd spent 10 years building an empire through ruthless efficiency. Then he'd spent weeks tearing it down through choices that valued humanity over survival. And now he was broken and bleeding in a safe house, trying to decide whether living as a fugitive was better than dying for truths that might not even matter in the long run. The old Cedric would have run without hesitation, survival over everything, build a new empire somewhere else, start fresh with lessons learned. But the old Cedric had died somewhere between confessing his crimes and dragging Pemberton into the Thames. What's left wasn't the monster anymore, wasn't the Duke who'd ruled through fear. What remained was just a man trying to figure out if he'd destroyed himself for something meaningful or just destroyed himself. "I need time," he said finally. "Time to heal, time to think, time to figure out what comes next when everything you built is ashes and everyone who knew you wants you dead." Seraphine nodded. "You have a week, maybe 2 if we're careful. After that, Crown forces will track us down and you'll need to decide whether you're running or making a stand." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. Confessing. Fighting Pemberton. Choosing to be human even when it cost you everything. You're saying that from inside a safe house while hiding from the same Crown forces hunting me. Hard to call that vindication. I'm saying it because I watched you become someone worth dying beside instead of someone worth running from. That matters more than whether we survive what comes next." She left before he could respond. Cedric lay in the cracked ceiling room and tried to process the idea that someone thought his transformation was worth the cost. That becoming human had value, independent of whether it led to survival or victory or any of the outcomes he'd spent a decade pursuing. The pain medication they'd given him was starting to wear off. Agony crept back into his wounds like fire spreading through dry wood. He could feel his body fighting infection, fighting blood loss, fighting the accumulated damage of bullets and near drowning and 3 days unconscious. He was alive. Barely. Temporarily. But alive. And for the first time in 10 years, he had no empire to protect. No reputation to maintain, no power to preserve through ruthless calculation. Just the question of what a man becomes when everything that defined him is stripped away. Outside, London continued its daily operations. Markets opened. Businesses conducted transactions. The aristocracy pretended the massacre hadn't exposed truths they'd rather keep buried. And somewhere in that city, Crown forces were hunting for Duke Cedric Blackthorne with orders to execute on sight. The old certainties were gone. The old strategies were useless. Everything he'd learned about survival through dominance no longer applied to a situation where he had nothing left to dominate. So what remained? What survives when empires fall and monsters learn to be human? Cedric closed his eyes and let the pain wash over him while he searched for an answer that made sense of everything he'd lost and everything he'd chosen. The answer, when it finally came, was simpler than he expected. What remains is the choice to keep trying, even when trying seems pointless. To keep being human, even when being human costs everything. To keep telling truth, even when truth guarantees destruction. Not because it leads to victory, not because it ensures survival, but because the alternative is becoming the monster again. And he'd finally learned that monsters don't get to rest. They just consume until there's nothing left to consume, then they consume themselves. He'd rather die human than live as a monster. Even if dying human meant ending up broken and bleeding in a safe house while everything he'd built turned to ash. At least it would be honest. At least it would be real. At least it would mean his destruction had purchased something more valuable than another decade of isolation and fear. The pain dragged him back toward unconsciousness, and this time Cedric didn't fight it. Just let the darkness come while his body tried to heal from wounds that went deeper than bullets could reach. Tomorrow he'd figure out whether he was running or dying. Tonight, he'd just rest in the knowledge that he'd finally chosen to be human. And that choice, however it ended, was the first thing he'd done in 10 years that felt like redemption instead of survival. The week that followed was measured in small victories against bodies that wanted to quit. Infection came on the 3rd day and nearly killed him before the surgeon managed to fight it back with techniques that were more butchery than medicine. Cedric spent 48 hours in fever dreams that showed him every person he'd destroyed, every family he'd ruined, every choice that had seemed necessary and felt unforgivable. When the fever broke, he was weaker but clearer. Like the sickness had burned away something that had been clouding his judgment for years. Seraphine stayed close, managing his care and coordinating with the network of people who'd decided protecting him was worth the risk. She brought newspapers that documented the chaos his confession had created. parliamentary investigations into corruption, public debates about wealth inequality, aristocrats scrambling to distance themselves from practices that looked too similar to what Blackthorne had admitted. The questions he'd raised weren't dying. If anything, they were spreading. One afternoon, while he was sitting up for the first time without wanting to scream, Adrian appeared in the doorway, looking nervous and determined. "Your Grace," the young man said formally. "Just Cedric now. The title's meaningless when you're a fugitive." Adrian moved into the room and sat in the chair Seraphine usually occupied. "I wanted to thank you for the warehouse, for protecting my family when you had every reason to let us burn. You already thanked me, and I already told you it was a tactically stupid decision that contributed to my current situation. I know, but I've been thinking about what you said in Parliament, about systems creating monsters, about how survival sometimes requires becoming something you hate." Adrian's voice was quiet but steady. "My father destroyed our family through gambling, made choices that seemed rational in the moment but compounded into catastrophe. And I watched you do the opposite, make choices that seemed catastrophic in the moment, but might actually mean something. Your point?" "My point is, I understand now why Seraphine believes in you, why she stayed when every logical calculation said to run. You became someone worth believing in." Cedric looked at this young aristocrat who'd nearly been executed as collateral damage in a conspiracy he barely understood, saw earnestness and idealism that hadn't been crushed yet by the realities of how the world actually functioned. Saw what he might have been if circumstances had been different. "Don't make me into something heroic," he said quietly. "I'm still guilty of everything I confessed to, still responsible for lives I destroyed and families I ruined. Choosing to be human at the end doesn't erase a decade of being a monster. Maybe not, but it suggests monsters can change, that people who've done terrible things can still choose to do better." Adrian stood. "Seraphine asked me to tell you the ships are ready. 3 different vessels leaving over the next week. You can disappear to America, to France, to anywhere that won't extradite you back to England. And if I don't want to disappear, then she says you're an idiot who's going to get everyone killed. But she'll stay anyway because apparently you've convinced her that dying for truth matters more than living for comfort." The young man moved toward the door. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, I think you should run. Live to fight another day. The questions you raised will continue spreading whether you're here or not." He left before Cedric could respond. The room fell silent except for London sounds and Cedric's own breathing. The ships were ready. Escape was possible. He could run, rebuild somewhere else, start fresh with lessons learned and a chance to apply them without the weight of his reputation. It was the smart choice, the survivor's choice, the decision the old Cedric would have made without hesitation. But the old Cedric was dead, and what remained wasn't sure survival was the highest value anymore. What? Seraphine found him that evening sitting by the window, watching London's sunset paint the sky, colors that looked like fire and blood mixed together. "You're planning something stupid," she said without preamble. "I can see it in your face. I'm planning to stay. That's not stupid. It's suicidal. Crown forces will find you within days. When they do, they'll execute you publicly to send a message about what happens to people who expose corruption." "I know. Then why?" "Because running proves I was just another powerful man escaping consequences. Staying and accepting punishment proves I meant what I said about accountability." Cedric turned from the window to face her. "I spent 10 years building an empire on the principle that survival justified any method. That power was the only thing that mattered, and morality was weakness disguised as principle. I was wrong about all of it, and the only way to prove I understand that is to stop running from consequences." "You'll die." "Probably. But at least I'll die for something that matters instead of living as a fugitive who talks about accountability while avoiding it." Seraphine moved closer, her expression torn between anger and something that looked like grief. "You're asking me to watch you surrender to execution after everything we went through to keep you alive. I'm telling you I finally understand what you've been trying to teach me, that being human means accepting the full weight of what you've done. Not running from it, not rationalizing it, just acknowledging it and accepting whatever comes next." He reached for her hand. "You said dying beside someone mattered more than surviving alone. I'm giving you the chance to walk away before that becomes literal. Take the ships. Disappear into a life that doesn't include watching me executed for crimes I absolutely committed. And if I don't want to walk away, then you stay knowing it ends badly, knowing I'm choosing this. Knowing everything we built together was always heading toward this moment, her fingers tightened on his. I hate this. I hate that you're choosing martyrdom over survival. I hate that you've decided dying for principle is more important than living to fight another day. But I understand why. And I'll stay because someone should witness what happens when a monster chooses to be human, even when being human guarantees destruction. They stood together in the fading light while London transformed from day to night. Two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of a collapsing empire. Two survivors who'd learned that survival wasn't always the highest value. Sometimes truth mattered more. Sometimes accountability mattered more. Sometimes choosing to be human cost everything and was still worth the price. Outside, Crown forces continued their search. Inside, Cedric felt something like peace settling over him for the first time in a decade. He was going to die, soon, publicly, as punishment for crimes he'd confessed to and truths he'd exposed. But he'd die as himself, not as the monster, not as the Duke who ruled through fear, just as a man who'd learned too late that power without humanity was just another prison. And maybe that lesson, witnessed and documented and spread through the questions he'd raised, would mean something to someone. Maybe it would plant seeds that grew into real change. Or maybe it would just be forgotten noise in a system designed to protect itself from accountability. Either way, he'd told the truth. He'd chosen humanity. He'd accepted consequences instead of running from them. And that choice, however it ended, was the first thing he'd done that felt like redemption. They came for him on the 9th day. Cedric was strong enough to stand by then, though walking remained difficult and his wounds ached with every movement. He was in the safe house sitting room when he heard boots on the stairs. Heavy, military, purposeful. Crown forces had found him. Seraphine moved to grab weapons, but he stopped her with a gesture. No more violence. I'm done running, and I'm done fighting. You can't just surrender. Watch me. The door burst open and soldiers poured in with rifles raised. An officer followed, a man Cedric recognized from parliamentary functions, someone who'd once smiled and taken Blackthorn money while voting for favorable legislation. Now he looked at Cedric with the cold satisfaction of a man who'd captured something dangerous. Duke Cedric Blackthorn, the officer said formally. You're under arrest for crimes against Parliament, murder of witnesses, and treason against the Crown. I won't resist. Cedric stood slowly, raising his hands despite the pain it caused. I'll come peacefully and accept whatever judgment is decreed. The soldiers looked surprised. They'd clearly expected violence, expected the monster to fight until the end, but the monster was dead. What remained was just a man accepting consequences. They shackled him anyway, led him down the stairs while Seraphine followed silently. The street outside was filled with Crown forces, enough soldiers to storm a fortress. All this for one broken fugitive. Cedric almost laughed at the absurdity. They loaded him into a prison carriage designed to prevent escape. Seraphine tried to follow, but soldiers blocked her. I go where he goes, she said firmly. You'll be arrested as an accomplice, then arrest me. The officer considered for a moment, then shrugged. Your choice. They shackled her too and loaded her into the carriage beside Cedric. As the vehicle started moving through London streets, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're really doing this. Surrendering, accepting execution. I'm really doing this. Why? Because I spent 10 years proving that power without accountability was just sophisticated barbarism. Now I'm proving that accountability matters even when accepting it costs everything. He looked out the carriage window at London passing by. The city he'd terrorized and ruled and ultimately failed. The empire I built was predicated on the idea that consequences were for weaker people. That power meant being able to escape punishment for anything. I was wrong, and the only way to prove I understand that is to stop escaping. You're insane. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally sane for the first time in a decade. The carriage rattled through streets that grew increasingly familiar. They were heading toward the tower, the ancient fortress where traitors and criminals had been imprisoned for centuries, where he would likely spend his last days before execution. The thought should have terrified him, should have triggered every survival instinct he'd honed over years of operating in deadly environments. Instead, he felt calm, almost peaceful. He'd made his choice, told his truth, accepted his consequences. Whatever came next was just the natural conclusion of finally choosing to be human instead of staying a monster. The carriage passed through the tower gates, and Cedric saw crowds gathered outside, hundreds of people watching his arrival, some shouting for his execution, others holding signs that quoted his parliamentary confession. Still others just watching in silence, their expressions unreadable. The questions he'd raised had spread further than he'd realized. People were talking, debating, questioning the systems that created men like him, and then acted shocked when those men did exactly what the systems rewarded. Maybe it would lead to change. Maybe it would be forgotten within weeks. Either way, the truth was out there. Planted, growing in whatever soil it could find. And that was enough. They led him into the tower and down corridors that had held countless prisoners before him. The cell they placed him in was small, cold, built from stones that had witnessed centuries of human suffering. It felt appropriate. Seraphine was placed in an adjacent cell. Through the narrow opening, he could see her face. "I'm sorry," he said, "for dragging you into this, for making you watch me choose death over survival. Don't apologize for finally being someone worth dying beside." Her voice carried something he'd never heard from her before. Not calculation, not pragmatism, just raw emotion delivered without armor or defense. "I watched you transform from a monster into a man. Watched you choose humanity even when it cost your empire. Watched you confess truths that destroyed you because those truths mattered more than your survival." She moved closer to the bars separating their cells. "You asked me once if I feared you. I told you I feared what you could do, but feared the world without your protection more. I was wrong. I don't fear you at all anymore. I just refuse to live in a world where people like you can't change, can't choose better, can't matter for something other than the power they wield." "Then live," he said quietly. "They'll execute me, but you can still walk away. Tell them you were coerced, that I manipulated you. Give them a story that lets you survive." "No, Seraphine. No." Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I stay. I witness. And when they execute you for choosing truth over survival, I make sure people remember that choice mattered." The corridor fell silent. Somewhere above them, London continued its operations. Markets, businesses, the endless machinery of commerce and power that would outlast them both. But in this cell, in this moment, Cedric felt something he'd never experienced in 10 years of building an empire. Connection. Real connection with another human being who saw everything he was and chose to stand beside him anyway. Not because he was powerful, not because he was useful, just because he'd finally become someone worth standing beside. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For seeing the man instead of the monster. For believing change was possible. For staying when every calculation said to run." He reached through the bars and she took his hand. "You gave me something I'd never had. Hope that the empire didn't have to be everything. That power wasn't the only currency that mattered. That being human was worth more than being feared. I just reminded you what you'd forgotten," she said quietly. "The rest was you choosing to remember." They stayed like that while footsteps echoed through the tower, while Crown forces conducted operations above, while London prepared for the trial and execution of Duke Cedric Blackthorne. Two people connected through prison bars. Two survivors who'd learned that surviving wasn't always the highest value. Two humans who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided that truth and connection and choosing to be better mattered more than power ever had. Outside, the world would judge them, would condemn them, would probably execute them both and forget them within a generation. But in this cell, in this moment, they had something the Empire had never provided. They had each other. They had truth. They had the knowledge that they'd chosen to be human, even when being human guaranteed their destruction. And that was enough. Not victory, not survival, not power or wealth, or any of the things Cedric had spent a decade accumulating. Just enough. Just human. Just real. The guards came eventually to separate them, to prepare Cedric for the trial that would formalize his execution. But before they did, he looked at Seraphine through the bars and said the thing he'd never said to anyone. "I love you. Not because you're useful or strategic, or any of the reasons I used to value people, but because you saw the monster and asked if he was tired. Because you believed change was possible when I'd given up on ever being anything other than what I'd become." She smiled through tears. "I love you too. For becoming someone worth loving. For choosing truth over survival. For finally understanding that power without humanity is just another cage." The guards pulled them apart and led Cedric toward the trial chamber. He walked without resistance. without regret, without the weight of an empire crushing down on him anymore. Just a man who'd learned too late that being human was the only thing that mattered. And that lesson, purchased with everything he'd built and everything he'd lost, was worth more than the empire had ever been. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict was predetermined. The execution was scheduled for dawn, and Duke Cedric Blackthorne stood in the center of the chamber and accepted it all with the calm certainty of someone who'd finally made peace with who he was and what he'd become. The monster was dead. What remained was human, and humanity, he'd finally learned, was worth dying for. Even when dying accomplished nothing except proving that change was possible and choices mattered and becoming better was the highest value of all. The sun rose on his last day, and Cedric watched it paint the sky colors that looked like hope and ending mixed together. Both seemed appropriate for a man who'd spent his life building power, and his death proving power meant nothing compared to choosing truth. The empire was ashes, the reputation was destroyed, everything he had accumulated was gone, but he was finally free. Finally human, finally himself. And that was enough.